Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where we slow down just long enough to notice the things the world has been quietly keeping to itself. There are forests that feel like they are holding their breath, not in a dramatic way, not in the way of a thriller or a horror story, but in the way of something very old and very patient that has learned it does not need to make noise to be powerful. You walk into it, and the sound of the world outside does not fade gradually, the way it does in a park or a woodland. It simply stops, and what replaces it is not silence exactly, but a different kind of presence. The hum of insects, the drip of water from leaves that caught rain 3 hours ago, the creak of something enormous shifting its weight somewhere in the canopy above you. It is a place that has its own rules, its own pace, its own sense of time. And tonight, we are going to talk about one of the most extraordinary places on Earth that operates exactly this way. Tonight, we are talking about the Congo Rainforest. And more specifically, we are going to talk about why crossing it is, in almost every practical sense, nearly impossible, not difficult, not challenging in the way that a serious mountain climb is challenging, not remote in the way that a desert crossing is remote, something closer to structurally, biologically, politically, and geographically resistant to the idea of being crossed at all. A place where the land itself, the water, the climate, the biology, and the human history have all arrived at roughly the same conclusion, which is that movement through the interior of this forest is something to be negotiated very carefully, and very slowly, and very humbly, and even then, probably not all the way through. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something small. Where are you listening from tonight? It is one of those questions I always find myself curious about, because the Congo Basin sits almost exactly on the equator, and the world looks very different depending on where you're sitting right now. Maybe you're in a cold room with the heat turned up a little too high and rain against the window. Maybe you are somewhere warm and the night outside is quiet. Maybe it is very late where you are, or very early. Whatever the case, I hope the space you are in is comfortable, because this is a long story and it is worth settling into. And if you are new here, welcome. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of slow, careful, curious storytelling, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it helps more people find their way to these kinds of conversations. And if tonight's topic is something you have been thinking about, or something that surprises you as we go, like on the video goes a long way. It is a small gesture that genuinely matters for a channel like this one. Alright, let us begin. The Congo Rainforest is the second largest tropical rainforest on the planet. The Amazon is larger, and that distinction tends to get most of the attention. But the Congo Basin is not a distant second. It covers approximately 3.3 million square kilometres, which is an area larger than the entire Indian subcontinent. It spreads across 6 countries: the Democratic Republic of Congo, which holds the vast majority of it, along with the Republic of Congo, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea. It is a forest so large that if you placed it over Europe, it would cover most of it. And yet for most people, it remains almost completely unfamiliar. Not because there is nothing to know about it, but because it has been, for most of human history, extraordinarily difficult to get into, and even more difficult to move through. The Congo River runs through the heart of it, and the river alone deserves a moment of attention before we go any further. The Congo River is approximately 4,700 kilometers long, making it one of the longest rivers in the world. But length is not what makes it remarkable. What makes it remarkable is its depth. The Congo River is the deepest river on Earth. In certain sections, it reaches depths of over 220 meters. To put that in some kind of human context, that is deeper than the height of most skyscrapers. There are fish living in the Congo River, in its deep, lightless lower channels, that have evolved in near-complete isolation from the surface world, species that exist nowhere else. The river is not just a geographical feature, it is its own ecosystem, and in many ways, it is its own world. The river is also, as we'll spend some time discussing later, the closest thing the Congo Basin has to a road, but it is a road with serious problems. It floods, it splits into hundreds of channels, it is blocked in critical places by some of the most dramatic rapids and cataracts in Africa, and it covers distances that take weeks to travel even by motorized boat. The river connects the interior of the forest to the outside world, but it does so on its own terms and at its own pace. Now, what I want to establish early on, because it shapes everything else we're going to talk about tonight, is that the Congo Rainforest is not simply remote. Remoteness, in the ordinary sense, is a matter of distance. You're far from things, and if you travel far enough, you arrive. The Congo Basin is something different. It is a place that resists movement. There is a distinction there that matters. You can be remote and still be crossable. The Sahara is remote. Antarctica is remote. Both have been crossed repeatedly by human beings willing to endure extraordinary hardship. The Congo Basin is different because the obstacles are not just a matter of distance or cold or heat. They are layered. They are biological, hydrological, political, climatic and geographic all at once, and they compound each other in ways that make the crossing not just hard but genuinely structurally almost impossible. Part of what makes this so interesting is that the forest does not look, from the outside, like it is doing anything aggressive. Satellite images of the Congo Basin show a vast green, almost peaceful-looking expanse. From above, it is beautiful. It is the kind of image that makes you think, surely people have walked through that, surely someone has made a path. And the answer, as we will find, is essentially no. Not all the way through. Not overland, not in any documented, verified, continuous way. And here is something that quietly underlines how resistant this place is to human understanding. Even modern satellite mapping has gaps when it comes to the Congo interior. Optical satellites are limited by cloud cover, which over the Congo Basin is nearly permanent in many areas. Radar imaging has helped, but the density of the forest canopy, combined with the complexity of the terrain beneath it, means that even today there are portions of the Congo Basin's interior that have not been accurately mapped at ground level. Scientists discovered a peatland system in the interior of the basin in 2017 that covers 145,000 square kilometres and had simply not been formally documented before, despite being one of the largest tropical peatlands on Earth. We will come back to that discovery in more detail later, but for now, that single fact tells you something important. This is a place that has been keeping its own secrets, not through any kind of drama or mysticism, but simply because it is so difficult to get into that even the people who study it from space have been missing things. There is a quality to the Congo Basin that I think is worth naming early, because it runs through everything else we are going to talk about tonight. The forest has a kind of patience. It does not fight you exactly. It does not stop you at a gate. It simply presents conditions, one after another, that make forward movement slower, more expensive, more dangerous and more exhausting than almost anywhere else on Earth. And those conditions are not occasional obstacles. They are the permanent state of the place. The heat, the humidity, the flooding, the disease, the political instability, the absence of roads, the presence of armed groups, the depth of the river, the density of the canopy. None of these things are rare events in the Congo Basin. They are the baseline. They are what the place is like on a normal day. And understanding that is the key to understanding why the Congo Rainforest is almost impossible to cross. Now, before we go any further into the specifics, I want to give you a sense of just how large this thing is in a way that is easy to hold in your mind. 3.3 million square kilometres. If you tried to walk across the widest part of the Congo Basin in a straight line, assuming you could walk in a straight line, which the train would not allow, you would be walking somewhere in the range of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometres. At a generous pace of 30 kilometres a day, which would be completely impossible in the interior for reasons we will discuss, that would be roughly 50 to 70 days of walking. But of course, you cannot walk 30 kilometres a day in the Congo Basin. You cannot walk 30 kilometers a day through permanent swamp and chest-high undergrowth and rivers with no bridges and forest floor that in many places is more water than earth. Realistic progress through the interior on foot, in documented accounts, has sometimes been measured in kilometers per day, single digits, and that is with a machete and a team and local knowledge and a significant amount of luck. The 6 countries that share the basin have a combined population of hundreds of millions of people, and yet the interior of the basin remains one of the most sparsely populated regions on Earth. That is not a coincidence. Human settlement in the Congo Basin clusters around rivers, because rivers are the only reliable way to move. The deep interior, away from navigable water, is where the forest resistance is strongest, and it is where human presence thins almost to nothing. The Congo River itself drains the entire basin. Every tributary, every seasonal flood, every rainfall event across 3.3 million square kilometers eventually finds its way into the Congo River system. The river's discharge rate, the volume of water it pushes into the Atlantic Ocean, is the second highest in the world, behind only the Amazon. At its mouth, the Congo River is pushing approximately 41,000 cubic meters of water per second into the ocean. It is an almost incomprehensible volume of water, and it gives you some sense of just how much rainfall the basin is receiving, and how thoroughly water-saturated the entire system is. Water is the dominant force in the Congo Basin. Not just the river, but the swamps, the seasonal flooding, the permanent wetlands, the humidity in the air, the rain that falls not once a year but in 2 distinct rainy seasons, across a landscape that is already saturated. We will spend time later looking at the specific geography of the interior swamp systems, the Cuvette Centrale in particular, which is one of the least travelled and least understood regions on the planet. But for now, just hold the image of a landscape where water is not a feature. Water is the texture of the place itself. There is something I find quietly astonishing about the Congo Basin, and it is this. It has been there, in roughly its current form, for a very long time. Tropical forests like the Congo are not new. They are ancient systems, and the Congo Basin in particular has been a refugium, a place of biological shelter, through multiple periods of global climate change. Species that disappeared elsewhere survived here. Ecosystems that were disrupted everywhere else persisted here. The forest has a kind of deep continuity to it that you do not find in younger landscapes, and perhaps that is part of why it feels so resistant to human crossing. It has been practicing at this for a very long time. Tonight we are going to work through all of it. The geography, the climate, the biology, the history of the people who have tried to cross it, and what happened to them, the infrastructure that was built and then swallowed back by the forest, the communities who have lived inside it for tens of thousands of years, and what their existence actually tells us, the modern attempts that have been made, and the modern failures that have resulted, the science that has tried to understand the interior from the outside, and finally, what all of this means for the future of a forest that has protected itself for so long by simply being impossible to move through. It is a big story. It is a patient story. And it begins, as most stories about the Congo do, with the land itself. The Congo Basin is shaped, at its most fundamental level, like a bowl. Not a gentle bowl, not a shallow depression you might barely notice, but a deep structural basin formed over millions of years of geological history, where the land sinks toward a vast interior low point, and the water that falls across the entire surrounding region has nowhere to go but inward and downward. The rivers that drain the outer edges of the basin all flow toward the centre, before eventually finding their way into the main Congo River channel. And what that means, in practical terms, is that the interior of the basin is not simply wet. It is a place where water accumulates, where it sits, where it spreads across the landscape in ways that make the boundary between river and land genuinely difficult to locate. This is not a metaphor. In the heart of the Congo Basin, in a region called the Cuvette Centrale, the Central Depression, there are hundreds of thousands of square kilometres, where the land is permanently flooded or seasonally inundated to such a degree that the distinction between swamp and forest is almost meaningless. The trees grow out of the water, their roots are submerged. The forest floor, if you can call it that, is a dark, slow-moving sheet of water covered in leaf litter and root systems, and the accumulated organic matter of centuries. Walking through it is not really walking, it is more like wading, constantly, through a medium that is somewhere between liquid and solid, and that offers no reliable footing at any point. The Cuvette Centrale covers roughly 500,000 square kilometres in total, though estimates vary depending on what you include in the definition. It sits primarily in the Republic of Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and for most of human history it was simply a place that people did not go. Not because of any particular decision, but because it offered nothing to enter for and everything to suffer for. The interior of the Cuvette Centrale has no high ground to aim for, no natural corridors that offer easier movement, no ridgelines or valleys that channel travel in useful directions. It is a flat, flooded, densely forested depression, and its flatness is part of what makes it so impenetrable. There is nothing to orient yourself by. The horizon, where you can see it at all through the canopy, looks the same in every direction. The water moves so slowly that you cannot always tell which way it is flowing, and the trees press close enough together that the light, even at midday, is dim and greenish, and offers very little sense of where the sun actually is. Within this already challenging landscape, there is something even more remarkable that was only formally documented relatively recently. In 2017, a team of scientists led by Simon Lewis and Greta Dargi published research confirming that the Cuvette Centrale contains one of the largest tropical peatland systems on Earth. We will come back to this discovery in more detail later in the evening, because it has significant implications for climate science. But for now, what matters is what peatland actually means for anyone trying to move through it. Peat is partially decomposed organic matter, plant material that has accumulated over thousands of years in waterlogged conditions where it cannot fully break down. The peatlands of the Cuvette Centrale cover approximately 145,500 square kilometres. They can be several metres deep. The surface is soft, compressible and unstable in a way that solid ground simply is not. Crossing peatland on foot means sinking with every step, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes knee deep, sometimes deeper. It is exhausting in a way that is difficult to describe without having experienced it, and it is slow in a way that makes already difficult terrain feel almost stationary. The fact that this peatland system had not been formally mapped and measured until 2017 tells you something important about how accessible the interior of the Cuvette Centrale actually is. This is not a small feature that was overlooked. It is a peatland complex the size of England, and it was, for practical purposes, unknown to science until the early 21st century, because getting to it and studying it required an extraordinary effort, and because the satellite imagery available before a certain point could not penetrate the forest canopy well enough to reveal what was underneath. Beyond the Cuvette Centrale, the Congo Basin's geography creates another layer of difficulty through its river system. The Congo River itself is the main channel, but the basin is threaded through with thousands of tributaries, ranging from enormous rivers in their own right to narrow, fast-moving streams that are nonetheless deep enough to stop foot travel completely. The Kasai River, which drains a large portion of the southern basin, is itself over 1,900 kilometres long. The Ubangi forms part of the northern border of the DRC and is a major river system in its own right. The Lomami, the Aruwimi, the Shuapa, the Lulonga. These are not small streams. They are rivers that, in any other context, would be considered significant geographical barriers. In the Congo Basin, they are simply part of the background texture of the landscape. What makes this particularly relevant to the question of crossing is that for enormous stretches of these rivers, there are no bridges. This is not a recent problem or a consequence of post-independence infrastructure collapse, though that has certainly made things worse. It is a fundamental feature of the basin. The rivers are wide, they are deep, they flow through terrain that makes bridge construction enormously difficult, and historically, the population density along many stretches has been low enough that the investment in permanent crossing infrastructure was never made. In many parts of the interior, crossing a tributary river means finding a pirogue, a dugout canoe, and a person willing to paddle you across. If you cannot find one, you wait. Or you go around, which in the Congo Basin can mean a detour of many kilometres through terrain that is no easier than what you were trying to avoid. The river crossings are not just logistically inconvenient, they are genuinely dangerous. The Congo River and its major tributaries carry strong currents. They harbour hippopotamuses, which are territorial and aggressive and responsible for a significant number of human deaths in Central Africa every year. The waters are home to crocodiles, and in many areas, the riverbanks themselves are flooded and unstable, making the approach to a crossing point as difficult as the crossing itself. There is a particular quality to navigating the Congo's river system, where each individual obstacle might seem manageable in isolation, but the cumulative effect of one river crossing after another, day after day, in heat and humidity, and with equipment that is already beginning to deteriorate, is something that breaks expeditions down in a way that is hard to account for in advance. The terrain between the rivers is its own challenge. The Congolian swamp forests, which cover large parts of the basin's interior, are a specific ecological type that is distinct even from the surrounding dense rainforest. The trees in these forests grow in standing water, and the understory, the layer between the ground and the upper canopy, is extraordinarily dense. Fallen trees do not decompose quickly enough to clear the path, so they accumulate, sometimes stacked on top of each other, creating tangles of rotting wood that are too unstable to walk on and too dense to push through. Movement through this kind of terrain requires cutting, climbing, and constant route-finding decisions, and it is exhausting in a way that is not just physically demanding but mentally grinding. Every few meters presents a new small problem. There is no stretch of easy walking to recover in. There is also something about the flatness of the basin that makes navigation genuinely difficult in a way that does not apply to mountainous or even rolling terrain. In a landscape with hills, you can climb to a high point and see where you are. You can use the shape of the land to understand your position. In the Congo Basin's interior, the land does not give you that. The elevation changes across enormous distances are minimal. The forest canopy closes over your head and blocks any long view. The rivers wind and loop in ways that make compass bearings unreliable guides to actual progress. A team moving through the interior of the basin can spend an entire day cutting through undergrowth and crossing flooded sections and feel, at the end of it, that they have barely moved. Because in terms of straight-line distance, they may not have. Modern GPS technology helps with knowing where you are, but it does not help with the terrain itself. Knowing your coordinates precisely does not drain the swamp or bridge the river or clear the undergrowth. And in the interior of the Congo Basin, where the conditions are wet and the humidity is extreme, electronic equipment has a shortened lifespan. Batteries drain faster in heat, screens fog, connections corrode. The forest is not hostile to technology in any intentional sense, but it is an environment that technology was not designed to endure indefinitely, and the gap between knowing where you are and being able to move through where you are is, in the Congo Basin, an enormous one. It is worth pausing here to think about what this geography actually means for the question of crossing. A crossing implies a line, a start point and an end point, and a path between them. The Congo Basin's physical structure makes all three of those things problematic. The start and end points are clear enough in theory, but the path between them passes through terrain that does not offer a natural route. There is no mountain pass, no river valley that runs in a useful direction for long enough, no coastal plain that provides easier movement. The basin's bowl shape means that any overland crossing of significant distance must pass through the interior, and the interior is the cuvette centrale, the swamp forests, the the flooded peatlands, the tributary maze. There is no way around the hard part. The hard part is the middle, and the middle is where everything converges. Some places are difficult to cross because of one dominant feature. A desert is hard because of heat and water scarcity. A high mountain range is hard because of altitude and cold. The Congo Basin is different in that its difficulty is not concentrated in one feature. It is distributed across the entire geography. The flooding is everywhere. The tributaries are everywhere. The dense vegetation is everywhere. The swamp systems extend across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. There is no single barrier to overcome. There is a whole landscape of barriers, layered on top of each other, reinforcing each other, extending in every direction. And that is what makes the geography of the basin so specifically resistant to crossing, rather than simply difficult to navigate. The colonial-era maps of the Congo Basin, which we will look at more closely later when we discuss the European expeditions, often left the interior blank or filled it with vague topographical sketches that bore little relationship to the actual terrain. This was not always dishonesty. It was, in many cases, a genuine reflection of how little was known, because the geography itself had prevented the kind of systematic survey that was possible in more accessible regions. Even today, with satellite imaging and aerial survey technology, the full detail of the basin's interior remains incompletely mapped in certain respects. The forest canopy hides what is underneath it. The peatlands were there for thousands of years before anyone measured them. The river channels in the deepest swamp areas shift with the seasons and the rainfall in ways that make any static map at least partially wrong. This is a place that has resisted not just physical crossing, but the kind of systematic knowledge that crossing usually produces. Explorers who traverse a landscape bring back information about it. They describe the terrain, they note the rivers, they sketch the elevations. The Congo Basin has resisted even that process, because the conditions that make crossing difficult also make documentation difficult, and the expeditions that have attempted to move through the interior have often been so consumed by the effort of survival that systematic observation became secondary to simply continuing. And yet, the land is not simply hostile in the way that a desert or a frozen tundra is hostile. It is extraordinarily alive. The Congolian swamp forests are among the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. The peatlands support a remarkable range of species. The rivers teem with fish. The forest canopy is dense with birds and insects and primates. The difficulty of the terrain is, in a very real sense, a product of its vitality. The forest is hard to cross because it is so thoroughly, relentlessly alive, growing and flooding and decomposing and regenerating at a pace that human movement cannot match and human infrastructure cannot keep up with. That vitality, that relentless biological energy of the basin, is something we're going to come back to throughout the evening. Because it is not just the physical geography that resists crossing, it is the living systems that inhabit and animate that geography, the climate that drives them, the biology that fills them, the diseases that move through them. The terrain is the foundation, but it is only the beginning of the story. And the next layer, the one that compounds everything the geography already presents, is the climate that sits over the basin like a second ceiling, warm and wet and permanent. That second ceiling is worth thinking about for a moment before moving through it, because climate in the Congo Basin is not a backdrop. It is not weather in the way that most people experience weather, as something that changes, that comes and goes, that has seasons in the familiar sense of dry and cool, alternating with warm and wet. The Congo Basin has seasons, technically. It has 2 rainy seasons each year rather than 1, a consequence of its position straddling the equator, where the intertropical convergence zone passes over the basin twice as the Earth tilts through its annual cycle. But what this means in practice is not that the forest experiences relief between rains. It means that different parts of the basin are wet at different times and that the overall system is almost never fully dry anywhere. The northern part of the basin receives its heaviest rainfall roughly between April and October. The southern part peaks between October and April. The equatorial centre receives rain more or less continuously throughout the year. For anyone attempting to plan a crossing and thinking that there might be a dry season window, a narrow corridor of easier conditions, the answer the basin offers is complicated. There is always somewhere that is flooding. There is always somewhere that is saturated. The idea of a dry crossing window is largely a fiction. Annual rainfall across the basin varies by location, but many interior areas receive between 1,600 and 2,200 millimetres of rain per year, with some zones receiving considerably more. To put that in a frame that is easier to picture, 2,000 millimetres is roughly 2 metres of rainfall, accumulating over 12 months. In places like London, average annual rainfall is around 600 millimetres. In New York, it is closer to 1,200. The Congo Basin's interior receives, in many areas, more than 3 times what a temperate city receives, and it receives it in a landscape that is already saturated, already low-lying, already structured to hold water rather than shed it. The rain does not run off cleanly into the sea. It percolates into peat, collects in swamp depressions, raises river levels, spreads across floodplains, and then, slowly, moves toward the main channel of the Congo River. The basin is designed, as we noted when discussing the geography, to accumulate water. The climate ensures there is always more water coming. Humidity is the other dimension of this, and it is one that is genuinely difficult to communicate to someone who has not experienced tropical humidity at its most extreme. In the Congo Basin's interior, relative humidity regularly sits above 85% and frequently exceeds 90%. On many days, particularly in the morning after a night of rain, it approaches 100%. At that level, the air is not simply damp, it is saturated. Sweat does not evaporate properly, which means the body's primary cooling mechanism stops working as it should. Temperatures in the basin hover between roughly 24 and 30 degrees Celsius throughout the year. That range sounds manageable. In dry air, it would be. But in air that is 90% humid, 28 degrees Celsius feels significantly more oppressive than it sounds, because the body cannot cool itself efficiently, and the heat accumulates in a way that is exhausting over hours and debilitating over days. Experienced tropical travellers describe the humidity of the Congo Basin's interior as something qualitatively different from coastal or lowland tropical humidity elsewhere. It is thick in a way that is hard to describe, and it does not lift at night in the way that some tropical climates do. The canopy traps the moisture close to the forest floor, and the temperature drop overnight is modest, rarely more than a few degrees. There is no real relief period. The conditions are simply continuous. What this does to equipment and supplies is something that explorers and researchers who have worked in the basin describe with a kind of weary specificity that makes it easy to believe. Fabric deteriorates within weeks, canvas rots, cotton clothing begins to develop mould within days of sustained use. Metal corrodes at a rate that is dramatically faster than in temperate environments. The iron fittings on equipment that would last years in a dry climate begin to rust through in a matter of weeks. Leather, which was the material of choice for boots and straps and harnesses throughout the age of exploration, breaks down rapidly in sustained humidity. The tannins that preserve it are gradually leached out. The fibres soften and separate, and what was a sturdy boot becomes something closer to a damp rag wrapped around the foot. This is not a minor inconvenience. For an expedition moving through terrain that requires reliable footwear, failing boots are a serious problem. For a team relying on rope or harness or strap to move equipment across water or up slopes, material failure is a safety issue. Modern synthetic materials have improved matters somewhat. Gore-Tex and nylon and high-density plastics resist moisture better than canvas and leather and iron. But they are not immune. Seams open, zippers corrode and seize. Synthetic fabrics that are marketed as moisture wicking become saturated in conditions of near total humidity and stop wicking anything. Electronic equipment, which modern travellers depend on for navigation, communication, and documentation, is particularly vulnerable. Humidity penetrates enclosures that are rated for rain, but not for sustained immersion in saturated air. Connectors corrode. Circuit boards develop shorts. Camera lenses fog from the inside as moisture condenses on the glass. Batteries, which lose capacity faster in heat, become unreliable. Satellite phones and GPS devices that are designed to military specifications can handle rain and brief submersion. But weeks of continuous high humidity at high temperatures create failure modes that even rugged equipment is not fully designed to resist. Researchers and journalists who have spent extended time in the basin's interior describe a steady attrition of equipment that begins almost immediately and accelerates as time passes. By the third or fourth week, the question is not which piece of equipment is failing, but which piece of equipment is failing most critically right now. Food and medicine face the same pressure. Dried foods absorb moisture from the air and begin to degrade. Medications that require dry storage become unreliable. The vacuum seal on packaged food weakens. Mold develops on surfaces that were clean the day before. This is a particular problem for longer expeditions because the supply calculations that work in temperate environments do not fully account for the rate at which the Congo Basin's climate consumes provisions. An expedition that plans for 30 days of food might find that a meaningful portion of its supplies are compromised by day 20, not because of poor planning, but because the environment operates at a pace that is simply faster than most planning models account for. There is something almost mechanical about the way the climate works against human movement. It is not dramatic. There are no sudden storms that destroy camps in an instant, though heavy rain can certainly cause flooding and complicate river crossings. The climate's resistance is more patient than that. It works through accumulation. Each day, the humidity does a little more damage to the fabric, the metal, the food, the medicine, the bodies of the people trying to move through the forest. Each day, the rain adds a little more water to the ground, raises the river a few centimetres, spreads the swamp a little further. The effect compounds over time in a way that is difficult to anticipate at the start of a journey, and very apparent by the middle of one. Experienced tropical explorers speak of a psychological weight that comes with sustained exposure to high humidity, a kind of damp fatigue that is distinct from ordinary tiredness. The body is working harder than usual to regulate its temperature, sleeping less efficiently because the nights are warm and damp, and the cumulative effect over weeks is a kind of grinding exhaustion that affects judgment and motivation in ways that are hard to separate from the physical difficulties of the terrain itself. The forest canopy adds another dimension to the climate's effect on movement, specifically on navigation. The Congo Basin's primary forest has a canopy layer that reaches between 30 and 45 metres in height, with emergent trees occasionally exceeding 50 metres. Beneath the canopy, the light levels on the forest floor are dramatically reduced, sometimes to less than 2% of the light available above the canopy. On a clear day, a person standing in the open can navigate by the position of the sun. On a clear night, they can navigate by stars. In the interior of the Congo Basin's forest, neither of these options is reliably available from ground level. The canopy is too dense and too continuous. Even on cloudless days, the patches of sky visible from the forest floor are small and irregular, and the sun moves across them in arcs that are difficult to track consistently when you can only see fragments of the sky at a time. At night, the canopy blocks the stars almost entirely in dense forest sections. Traditional celestial navigation, which was the primary method available to the early European expeditions, and remains a useful backup for modern travellers when the electronics fail, is simply not practical in much of the basin's interior. This matters more than it might initially seem. GPS tells you where you are, as we noted when discussing the terrain. But in the Congo Basin, knowing where you are and knowing how to move toward where you want to be are two different problems. The terrain between any 2 points is almost never a straight line. It involves detours around flooded sections, alternative routes around impassable swamp, river crossings at whatever points affordable or narrow enough to bridge. A traveller constantly making these detours in a forest where they cannot see the sun to maintain a general bearing can lose their sense of direction over the course of hours. The forest floor looks largely similar in every direction. The vegetation does not offer obvious landmarks. The rivers, which might seem like reliable guides, branch and loop in ways that can be actively misleading if you're trying to follow one in a particular direction. Without reliable celestial navigation, and without constant access to a functioning GPS, maintaining a consistent direction of travel in the interior of the Congo Basin is genuinely difficult, and the difficulty compounds every time the electronics degrade or the battery runs low. There is a quietness to all of this that is worth noting. The climate does not announce itself as an obstacle. It does not present a wall or a cliff or a rapid that says clearly, here is where the difficulty is. It surrounds, it permeates, it works on everything simultaneously, on the equipment and the food and the bodies and the navigation tools and the psychological reserves of the people trying to move through it. An expedition can be fully aware of everything the climate will do, can read the accounts of previous travellers and prepare accordingly, and still find that the reality of sustained exposure to it is something that preparation only partially addresses. The Congo Basin's climate is one of those things that is easier to understand in the abstract than to endure in practice, and the gap between understanding and endurance is one of the reasons why the crossing remains so difficult even for people who arrive well-informed and well-equipped. It is also worth noting that the climate and the terrain reinforce each other in ways that make the combined effect greater than either would be alone. The rainfall fills the swamps and raises the rivers, which increases the area of flooded terrain, which forces more detours, which extends the time spent in the forest, which means longer exposure to the humidity and the heat, which degrades the equipment and the supplies and the physical condition of the travellers more severely, which makes the remaining journey harder. Each element feeds back into the others. A traveller who is slowed by flooded terrain spends more time in the humidity. More time in the humidity means more equipment failure. More equipment failure means slower movement. Slower movement means more time in the terrain. The loop is not vicious in a dramatic sense. It is quiet and patient and relentless, which in some ways makes it more difficult to resist than a single dramatic obstacle would be. And then, sitting underneath all of this, embedded in the same warm, wet air and the same dense forest, is the biological layer. Because the climate that makes the Congo Basin so difficult for human equipment and human bodies to endure is also the climate that makes it extraordinarily productive for everything else. The warmth and the moisture that corrode metal and rot canvas and exhaust travellers are exactly the conditions that drive one of the most complex biological systems on the planet. The insects, the diseases, the plants, the animals that fill the basin are not separate from the climate. They are expressions of it. They thrive in the conditions that human movement struggles against. And the biological systems of the Congo Basin, the things that live in and through, and because of that warm, wet, permanent climate, present their own category of resistance to crossing, one that is not passive or geological, but active and living, and in some cases directly targeted at anything moving through the forest. That is the next layer of the story, and it is in some respects the most intimate one. But before we arrive at the biology, there is one more system that deserves its own careful attention, something that seems, at first glance, like it should solve the problem rather than compound it: the Congo River itself. When people think about crossing the Congo Basin, the river is usually the first thing they reach for mentally. Of course. There it is on the map, this enormous blue line threading through the centre of the forest, running from the highlands of the east all the way to the Atlantic coast in the west. Surely, the thinking goes, the river is the road. Surely the thing that makes the basin what it is also provides the way through it. And this is not an unreasonable thought. Rivers have served as highways through difficult terrain for as long as human beings have moved through landscapes. The Amazon, the Nile, the Mekong. All of them have functioned as corridors, as routes, as the lines along which civilization and trade and exploration have organized themselves. Why not the Congo? The answer is that the Congo River does function as a road, partially, intermittently, in certain stretches and under certain conditions. It is in fact the closest thing to a reliable route through the basin that exists. But it is a road that breaks. It is a road with gaps in it, some of the most dramatic and impassable gaps in the world, and understanding where those gaps are and why they exist tells you a great deal about why the basin resists crossing in the particular way that it does. The Congo River is approximately 4,700 kilometers long from its headwaters in the highlands of southeastern Democratic Republic of Congo, near the border with Zambia, in the region around the Lualaba River, to its mouth at the Atlantic. That makes it the 9th longest river in the world by length, though length alone does not capture what makes it exceptional. What makes the Congo genuinely remarkable among the world's rivers is its discharge rate, the volume of water it moves. The Congo discharges approximately 41,000 cubic meters of water per second into the Atlantic Ocean, which makes it the second largest river in the world by discharge, behind only the Amazon. To put that in some kind of scale, the Congo River alone accounts for roughly 30% of all the fresh water discharged into the Atlantic Ocean from the African continent. The river is not just large, it is, in hydrological terms, something close to extraordinary. It is also the world's deepest river. In certain sections downstream of Kinshasa, the river reaches measured depths of more than 220 meters. Parts of it have not been fully sounded. The depth is partly a consequence of the river's enormous discharge being channeled through a relatively confined canyon in the lower reaches, and partly a consequence of the geological history of the basin itself. The river has been carving its channel for millions of years, and in the lower reaches it has carved very deeply indeed. All of this volume, all of this power, all of this depth, it flows through the basin in a shape that is not a simple line from east to west. The Congo River curves. It sweeps northward from its headwaters before bending west and then southwest toward the coast. It crosses the equator twice, which is unusual for a major river, and is part of why it maintains such a consistent flow year-round. The two rainy seasons on either side of the equator tend to offset each other, so while one part of the catchment is in its wet season, another is drier, and the result is a river that does not experience the dramatic seasonal flooding and shrinking that characterizes rivers in more strongly seasonal climates. The Congo is relatively stable. This is useful. A river that is navigable in 1 month and a shallow mudflat in another is not much of a highway. The Congo's consistency makes it more reliably useful as a route than it might otherwise be. And for a long stretch of its course, roughly from Kisangani in the northeast of the DRC down to Kinshasa in the west, a distance of somewhere around 1,700 kilometers, the river is, in fact, navigable by large vessels, barges, ferries, cargo boats. This is the stretch that functions as the basin's primary artery, the closest thing the interior has to a main road, and we'll come back to what travel along that stretch actually looks and feels like, because it is a world unto itself. But the point for now is that this central section of the river works. It moves people and goods across an enormous distance through terrain that would otherwise be nearly impassable. The problem is what happens at the ends. Downstream of Kinshasa, the river encounters the Crystal Mountains, a range of hills that the river has spent millions of years cutting through on its way to the sea. In that cutting, it has created something remarkable, and for any traveller hoping to use the river as a continuous highway, something deeply inconvenient. The stretch of river between Kinshasa and the Atlantic coast, roughly 350 kilometres, contains a series of 32 cataracts and rapids known collectively as the Livingstone Falls, named by Henry Morton Stanley after David Livingstone during Stanley's descent of the river, in the 1870s. The name is a little misleading in the sense that these are not a single dramatic waterfall in the way the name might suggest. They are a succession of rapids, drops, narrows, and turbulent sections strung together along that 350-kilometre stretch, each one individually ranging from serious to genuinely lethal for boat navigation, and collectively forming a barrier that makes the lower Congo completely unnavigable by conventional rivercraft for its entire length between the capital and the coast. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a fundamental fracture in the river as a highway. Any cargo or person moving between the interior of the basin and the Atlantic coast must leave the river at Kinshasa, travel overland around the Livingston Falls, and rejoin the river or reach the coast by another means. The colonial-era railway between Matadi on the coast and Kinshasa was built specifically to bridge this gap, and we will get to that story in some detail later, because the building of that railway is a story that tells you almost everything you need to know about what the Congo does to human ambition and human bodies. But the structural point is this: the river, the great highway of the basin, has a 350-kilometre section near its mouth where it simply cannot be used, where the road breaks, and that is not the only break. Moving in the other direction, upstream from Kisangani toward the headwaters in the southeast, the river encounters a different kind of obstacle. The Upper Congo, the section known as the Lualaba, before it officially becomes the Congo, passes through a series of rapids and falls near Kisangani itself. These are the falls that Stanley called the Stanley Falls, now known as the Boyoma Falls, a series of 7 cataracts spread across about 100 kilometres of river. They are not as dramatic in their individual drops as some famous waterfalls, but they are continuous enough and turbulent enough to prevent navigation by large vessels. The Boyoma Falls mark the effective upper limit of the navigable Middle Congo. Below them, the river is open. Above them, travel by large boat becomes much more difficult and eventually impossible without portaging around each obstruction. So the Congo River, as a highway, looks like this: a long navigable central section, approximately 1,700 kilometres, running from Kisangani to Kinshasa. Below Kisangani, the Boyoma Falls block the way upstream. Below Kinshasa, the Livingston Falls block the way to the sea. The highway has barriers at both ends. To use it, you have to find a way around those barriers, and finding a way around them means going overland, into the forest, through the terrain, and the humidity and the flooded ground that we have already spent some time describing. The river solves some of the problem and creates the rest of it. And then there is the tributary system, which adds another layer of complexity to the picture. The Congo River does not move through the basin alone. It is fed by an enormous network of tributaries, rivers that drain the surrounding forest and swamp and highland into the main channel. The major ones have names that appear on maps: the Kasai, which drains much of the southern basin and is itself a substantial river; the Ubangi, which forms much of the border between the DRC and the Republic of Congo to the north; the Lomami, which runs roughly parallel to the main Congo through the central basin; the Aruwimi, which drains the northeastern forest; the Sangha, the Likwala, the Ruki. There are dozens of named tributaries and thousands of smaller streams and channels that do not appear on most maps at all. These tributaries are not simply feeders for the main river, they are barriers. Any overland route through the basin that does not follow the main river will encounter these tributaries repeatedly, and crossing them is not straightforward. In the dry season, some of the smaller ones can be forded or bridged with improvised means. In the wet season, many of them expand dramatically, spreading into the surrounding forest and creating wide zones of flooded ground on either side of the main channel. The distinction between river and forest floor becomes blurred. A stream that is 10 metres wide in the dry season may have a flooded margin of several hundred metres on each bank in the wet season, and crossing that zone means moving through water that ranges from ankle deep to chest deep, over ground that is uneven and often concealed beneath the surface. You cannot see what you are stepping on. You cannot see where the deeper channels are until you're in them. For the early European expeditions, the tributaries were a constant source of delay and danger. Crossing even medium-sized tributaries required building rafts or canoes, finding shallow crossing points, or negotiating with local communities who had boats. Stanley's accounts from his expeditions through the basin describe tributary crossings as among the most time-consuming and exhausting elements of travel, not because any individual crossing was necessarily catastrophic, but because there were so many of them, and each one required effort and time and resources that the expedition could not easily spare. A journey that might cover 20 kilometres in a single day on open ground might cover 4 or 5 kilometres when that ground included a tributary crossing and its associated flooded margins. Modern travellers face the same problem, with the additional complication that the bridges that were built during the colonial era, and there were not many of them, given the scale of the basin, have largely deteriorated or collapsed. A bridge that appears on a map from the 1970s may not exist in any functional form today. Travellers who have attempted overland routes through the DRC in the 2000s and 2010s describe arriving at river crossings shown on their maps as bridged and finding nothing but the ruined abutments of a structure that collapsed years or decades earlier. The crossing still has to be made. It just has to be made without the bridge. There is something quietly instructive about the way the river system works as both the solution and the problem. The Congo River offers the only real corridor through the basin, and that corridor is broken at its most critical points. The tributaries that make the basin what it is, that carry the rainfall out of the forest, that feed the swamps, that sustain the extraordinary biological richness of the region, are the same features that make overland movement so difficult. The water that defines the Congo Basin is also the water that resists being crossed. What this means in practical terms is that any serious attempt to traverse the basin has to engage with the river on the river's own terms. You cannot ignore it. You cannot simply go around it, because the basin is too large and the forest too dense for any overland route to avoid the river system entirely. But you also cannot follow it continuously from one end of the basin to the other, because the falls and the rapids break the route at key points and force you back onto land. The river gives and takes in roughly equal measure, and the traveller who tries to use it as a highway has to be prepared for the moments when the highway simply ends and something else, something slower, harder, and more uncertain, has to begin. This interplay between the river as corridor and the river as obstacle is one of the things that makes the Congo Basin different from other large forest systems. The Amazon, for all its difficulty, has a river system that is navigable over much longer continuous stretches. The Congo's broken navigability, the way it offers passage and then withdraws it, is part of what gives the basin its particular character as a place that resists linear crossing. You can move through it, but not in a straight line, and not without repeatedly negotiating with the water for permission to continue. And the water, as it turns out, is not the only thing you have to negotiate with, because living in the water, along the water's edges, in the forest that the water sustains, is everything else. The insects, the parasites, the animals, the diseases that have evolved over millions of years in exactly the warm, wet, productive conditions that the river system creates. The biological layer of the Congo Basin is not separate from the hydrological one. It grows out of it. It depends on it. And it presents, to anything trying to move through the basin, a kind of resistance that is neither geological nor climatic, but alive, adaptive, and in some cases specifically oriented toward the warm-blooded creatures that the forest's edge has always attracted. So when we talk about the biological layer of the Congo Basin, it helps to think of it not as a collection of individual hazards arranged in a list, but as a system that has been building and refining itself for millions of years in conditions that are almost perfectly calibrated for biological productivity. Warmth, moisture, darkness, stillness, and an extraordinary abundance of organic material at every level of the food chain. What the Congo Basin produces in these conditions is life in a density and variety that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the outside. and a significant portion of that life is oriented in one way or another toward finding and consuming other living things, not maliciously. Not with any awareness of the traveller moving through the undergrowth, but with a kind of indifferent efficiency that amounts, from the traveller's perspective, to something very much like active resistance. Start with the insects, because they are the most pervasive and in many ways the most consequential. The Congo Basin is tsetse fly country. The tsetse fly, genus Glossina, is a biting insect roughly the size of a large housefly, and it is the vector for trypanosomiasis, which most people know as sleeping sickness. The disease is caused by a microscopic parasite, Trypanosoma brucei, which the fly injects into the bloodstream when it feeds. In the early stages, the infection causes fever, headaches, joint pain, and swollen lymph nodes. In the later stages, the parasite crosses the blood-brain barrier and begins affecting the central nervous system, causing confusion, disrupted sleep cycles, and eventually, without treatment, death. The name sleeping sickness comes from the neurological phase, when patients experience an inversion of their normal sleep patterns, sleeping during the day and lying awake at night, and a progressive deterioration of mental function that can look, from the outside, like a slow withdrawal from the world. Sleeping sickness is not a minor inconvenience. Historically, it was one of the most significant factors in limiting human movement and settlement across large parts of Central Africa. In the early 20th century, epidemics killed hundreds of thousands of people across the Congo Basin and neighbouring regions. A particularly severe outbreak in Uganda between 1900 and 1906 killed an estimated 200,000 people. Belgian colonial authorities in the Congo attempted to control the disease through aggressive quarantine measures and forced population resettlement, moving communities away from tsetse-infested riverbanks and forest edges. These efforts were only partially successful and caused enormous suffering in their own right. What they reveal, though, is how seriously the disease was taken as an obstacle to colonial control and economic exploitation of the basin. The tsetse fly was not just a nuisance, it was a geographic barrier, effectively rendering large areas of the forest dangerous to travel through for extended periods. Today, sleeping sickness has been significantly reduced through sustained public health efforts. The WHO reported fewer than 1,000 cases globally in 2018, a remarkable achievement compared to the epidemic levels of a century ago. But it has not been eliminated. Cases still occur in the DRC, which has historically accounted for the majority of the global disease burden, and the tsetse fly itself is still present throughout the basin, still biting, still capable of transmitting the parasite. For a traveller moving through the forest for weeks or months, the risk is real, if not as catastrophic as it once was. And the historical weight of the disease matters for understanding why the basin resisted human penetration so effectively for so long. The tsetse fly did not just threaten individual travellers, it shaped the entire human geography of the region, determining where people could live, where trade routes could run, and where colonial infrastructure could be built and maintained. River blindness, known medically as onchocerciasis, is a different kind of threat and comes from a different vector. It is caused by a parasitic worm, Onchocerca volvulus, transmitted by the blackfly, genus Simulium. Blackflies breed in fast-moving, well-oxygenated water, which means they are concentrated along the rapids and cataracts that characterize so much of the Congo's tributary system. The disease causes severe itching, skin lesions, and, in its advanced stages, progressive vision loss and blindness. It has historically been most severe in communities living near fast-moving rivers, precisely the kinds of rivers that a traveller crossing the basin would need to follow or cross repeatedly. In some affected communities in West and Central Africa, blindness rates among older adults reached 30 or 40% before control programs began in the 1970s. The onchocerciasis control program and its successor programs have dramatically reduced transmission in many areas, but the disease remains endemic in parts of the DRC, and the black fly remains present wherever the water conditions favour it. Malaria is perhaps the most familiar name on this list, but familiarity can obscure how serious the situation in the Congo Basin actually is. The DRC has one of the highest malaria burdens in the world. In 2020, the WHO estimated that the DRC accounted for roughly 12% of all global malaria cases and around 11% of all malaria deaths. Children under 5 are the most severely affected, but the disease is dangerous to anyone without established immunity, which means that travellers from outside the region or from areas where malaria is less prevalent face significant risk. What makes the situation in the Congo Basin particularly concerning from a traveller's perspective is the documented presence of drug-resistant strains of Plasmodium falciparum, the most dangerous of the malaria-causing parasites. Resistance to chloroquine, once the standard treatment, has been widespread in the DRC for decades. Resistance to artemisinin-based therapies, the current frontline treatment, has been documented in Southeast Asia, and there is ongoing surveillance concern in Africa. For a traveller moving through the basin for an extended period, prophylactic medication is essential but not guaranteed to be fully effective, and access to treatment in the interior is extremely limited. Beyond the disease vectors, the forest has other biological inhabitants that present more immediate physical dangers. The driver ant genus Dorylis is one of the most remarkable and in certain circumstances most alarming creatures in the African forest. These are not the small ants of a kitchen counter. Driver ants form colonies of up to 20 million individuals, and when they move as a coordinated mass that can be several meters wide and extend for hundreds of meters. They are carnivorous and will consume essentially anything they can overwhelm, including insects, small vertebrates, and in unusual circumstances, larger animals that cannot move away from their path. A column of driver ants moving through the undergrowth makes a distinctive sound, a soft crackling and rustling that experienced forest travellers learn to recognise and take seriously. The correct response is to move out of the way and wait for the column to pass. The incorrect response is to stand in it, which results in thousands of simultaneous bites from ants with powerful mandibles, an experience that is genuinely dangerous to anyone who cannot move quickly. For a traveller who is already weakened by illness or injury, or who is sleeping without adequate protection, a driver ant column can cause serious harm. There are documented cases of driver ants killing incapacitated humans and large animals. These are not common events, but they are not impossible ones either. The forest also contains larger animals that present dangers of a more straightforward kind. Forest elephants, Loxodonta cyclotis, are smaller than their savanna relatives but no less dangerous when disturbed. They are notably more cryptic, moving quietly through dense vegetation in ways that can bring them very close to travellers before they are detected. Forest buffalo, a subspecies of the African buffalo, are present in parts of the basin and are considered among the most dangerous large mammals in Africa, known for their unpredictability and their tendency to charge when surprised or cornered. The forest also supports populations of western lowland gorillas and chimpanzees, which are not typically dangerous to humans but can become aggressive if they feel threatened or if their social groups are disturbed. And then there are hippopotamuses. Hippos are not a forest animal in the strict sense, but they are abundant in the rivers and lakes of the Congo Basin, and they are responsible for more human deaths in Africa each year than almost any other large animal. Estimates vary, but figures commonly cited range from 500 to 3,000 deaths annually across the continent. The reliable data is difficult to obtain. Hippos are territorial, aggressive, and surprisingly fast on land, capable of reaching speeds of around 30 km per hour over short distances. They are most dangerous at night when they leave the water to graze, and in situations where a boat or canoe comes between a hippo and open water. For anyone travelling the rivers of the Congo Basin by pirogue or small boat, the hippo is a constant and genuine concern. Experienced river travellers describe learning to read the water for signs of hippo presence. The ears and eyes just above the surface, the distinctive snort, the ripple of a submerging animal, and giving them wide berth whenever possible. Not all encounters allow for that. What makes the biological dimension of the Congo Basin so significant as an obstacle to crossing is not any single species or disease, but the cumulative weight of all of them together. A traveller moving through the basin for several weeks is not facing one biological challenge. They are facing dozens of them simultaneously, and the challenges interact with each other and with the physical and climatic conditions of the environment in ways that compound their effect. A traveller weakened by malaria is more vulnerable to other infections. A traveller who has lost sleep to insects is less alert to the signs of a hippo or an elephant. A traveller whose equipment has been degraded by humidity and heat is less able to protect themselves against insect bites. The forest does not attack travellers with a single overwhelming force. It wears them down through accumulation, through the relentless pressure of 1,000 small demands on their energy, their attention, and their health. This is something that the early European expeditions experienced in a particularly raw form, before modern medicine and insect repellent and water purification. Stanley's accounts describe men dying not from dramatic events, but from the slow accumulation of illness and exhaustion. Fever after fever, wound after wound that would not heal in the humidity. The body simply running out of the reserves needed to keep going. The forest did not need to be dramatic about it. It just needed to be persistent, and it is extraordinarily persistent. There is a detail from natural history that has always seemed to me to capture something essential about the biological character of the Congo Basin. In the forest, organic material that falls to the ground, a dead leaf, a piece of fruit, a fallen branch, is typically consumed and broken down within days or weeks. The rate of decomposition in the warm, wet conditions of the equatorial forest is among the fastest on Earth. Fungi, bacteria, insects, and larger scavengers process organic matter with a thoroughness and speed that has no equivalent in temperate environments. A piece of leather left on the forest floor will be gone in a matter of weeks. A cotton shirt, given enough time and moisture, will disintegrate. The same processes that break down dead organic matter do not distinguish carefully between dead organic matter and the equipment, clothing and supplies of a living traveller. Boots rot, ropes weaken, metal rusts and corrodes. Food spoils faster than expected. The forest is not trying to destroy what a traveller brings into it. It is simply doing what it does to everything, which is to break it down and reclaim it. The traveller's gear is, from the forest perspective, just more organic material to be processed. This is the biological layer of the Congo Basin, and it does not sit separately from the hydrological layer or the climatic layer. It grows out of them, is sustained by them, and in turn shapes the experience of anyone trying to move through the basin in ways that are just as fundamental as the terrain itself. The insects need the water. The parasites need the insects. The large animals need the vegetation that the water and the warmth produce. The decomposers need the organic richness that the whole system generates. It is all one thing, really. A vast interconnected biological engine that has been running for millions of years and has no particular interest in making room for travellers. Understanding the biological layer also helps explain something that might otherwise seem puzzling about the history of exploration in the Congo Basin. The expeditions that tried to cross or penetrate it were not, by the standards of their time, poorly equipped or poorly led. Stanley was one of the most experienced and resourceful explorers of the Victorian era. The Belgian colonial administration had access to significant resources and genuine organisational capacity. And yet both were repeatedly stopped, slowed, or broken by the forest. The reason is not incompetence. The reason is that the biological resistance of the basin is genuinely formidable, and it operates at a scale and with a persistence that no individual expedition, however well prepared, can simply overpower. You can bring medicine, and the forest has diseases that resist your medicine. You can bring strong equipment, and the forest will rot it. You can bring food, and the humidity will spoil it faster than you planned. You can bring maps, and the maps will not show you the driver ant column moving through the undergrowth toward your camp at 3 in the morning. The forest does not need to be malevolent, it just needs to be itself, and being itself is enough. Which is, in a way, exactly what the first serious European attempts to cross the basin discovered. Not in the comfortable retrospective way that we can observe it now, with a century and a half of additional knowledge, but in the immediate and often devastating way that comes from being inside the forest without enough understanding of what the forest actually is. The men who followed Stanley into the Congo Basin in the 1870s and 1880s were walking into a biological system they had no framework to fully comprehend, armed with equipment and assumptions that had been developed for entirely different environments. What happened to them is not a story of adventure in the romantic sense. It is something quieter and harder than that. Henry Morton Stanley arrived at the eastern edge of the Congo Basin in 1876 with a large, well-organised column and a specific objective: to follow the Lualaba River northward and westward, to determine once and for all whether it connected to the Nile or to the Congo, and to trace whatever river system he found all the way to the Atlantic coast. He had already crossed Africa once before, from Zanzibar to the west coast, between 1871 and 1872, searching for David Livingstone. He was not a naive man about African travel. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most experienced European explorer operating on the continent at that time. He had seen difficult terrain, difficult climate, difficult circumstances. He thought he understood what he was walking into. He did not. The expedition that left Nyangwe on the Lualaba River in November 1876 consisted of Stanley, 3 other European officers, and somewhere between 200 and 240 African porters, soldiers, and guides. The number varies slightly depending on the source because the column was not a fixed thing. It gained some people along the way and lost far more. By the time Stanley reached the Atlantic coast at Boma in August 1877, the journey had taken approximately 999 days from its original departure point in Zanzibar, and the column had lost roughly 2/3 of its original members. Not 2/3 who turned back or deserted, though some did. 2/3 who died. The causes of death were not dramatic in the way that exploration narratives sometimes suggest. There were attacks. The column was assaulted repeatedly by communities along the river who had good reason to be hostile to armed strangers moving through their territory. In some cases, these were communities with direct experience of the Arab slave trade that had devastated the region, and a column of armed men moving through the forest was a reasonable thing to be afraid of. Stanley describes a series of confrontations near what he called Stanley Falls, the stretch of 7 cataracts now known as Boyoma Falls in the northeastern part of the basin. These falls are not a single dramatic drop, but a series of rapids spread over roughly 100 kilometers of river, and navigating past them required the column to move along the bank through dense forest, while simultaneously managing attacks from the river. It was by any measure one of the most difficult passages of the entire journey, but the attacks, as terrible as they were not the primary cause of the column's losses. Disease was malaria, dysentery, smallpox, and a range of other infections that the column could not identify, and had no effective treatment for move through this men steadily and without pause throughout the journey. Stanley's journals describe men who were healthy at breakfast and delirious with fever by nightfall. He describes the difficulty of moving sick men through terrain that offered no easy path, of making decisions about whether to stop and wait for a man to recover or to keep moving and risk losing him to the effort. He describes the weight of those decisions, the exhaustion of making them day after day. The European officers fared no better than the African members of the column in this respect. Francis Pocock, one of Stanley's closest companions on the expedition, drowned in the Livingstone Falls in June 1877, when the boat he was navigating capsized in the rapids. Edward Barker died of illness early in the journey. The other European officer, Frederick Barker, died of fever. By the time Stanley reached the coast, he was the only European survivor of the original party. He had been ill himself multiple times during the journey, and by his own account he had come close to death on several occasions. The man who arrived at Boma in August 1877 was not the same man who had set out from Zanzibar. He was thinner, older, marked in ways that photographs from the period make visible even now. The Livingstone Falls portage deserves particular attention because it illustrates something specific about the physical nature of the Congo that goes beyond the general difficulty of the terrain. The Livingstone Falls, the series of 32 cataracts that Stanley himself named, stretching for roughly 350 kilometres between what is now Kinshasa and the river's mouth at the Atlantic, are not navigable by any conventional watercraft. The river drops approximately 270 metres over this stretch, and the combination of gradient and the Congo's enormous discharge creates conditions that are genuinely violent. Stanley's column had to haul their boats overland around sections of the falls, cutting paths through forests that had no existing trails, moving wooden boats that weighed hundreds of kilograms through undergrowth and over rock. The process took weeks for each major section. Men were injured, equipment was damaged or lost. And through all of it, the column was also managing illness, food shortages, and the ongoing threat of conflict with local communities. There is a passage in Stanley's account of the Livingstone Falls portage that has stayed with researchers and historians, partly because of its plainness. He describes a morning when the column had managed to move one of the larger boats approximately 400 metres along the portage route. 400 metres. In a full day of labour, with every man available working, they had moved a single boat 400 metres through the forest. And then they had to go back and start on the next one. The scale of the effort required to cover even small distances in the Congo basin, when you're not moving with the river but across or around it, is something that numbers alone cannot fully convey. You need the image of those men, exhausted and sick, hauling a wooden boat through the undergrowth, to begin to feel what the terrain actually demanded. Stanley returned to the Congo basin a decade later, in 1887, on what became known as the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition. The objective this time was to travel from the Atlantic coast into the interior of Central Africa to relieve Emin Pasha, the governor of Equatoria, who had been cut off by the Mahdist uprising in Sudan. Stanley chose to approach from the west through the Congo rather than from the east, and this decision led his column into the Ituri Forest, the dense ancient rainforest in what is now northeastern Democratic Republic of Congo, for a passage that became one of the most catastrophic episodes in the history of African exploration. The Ituri Forest is a distinct ecosystem even within the broader Congo basin. It is older, in some respects more complex, and in terms of undergrowth density, it is among the most difficult terrain in the entire basin to move through on foot. The column that entered the Ituri in 1887 was large, somewhere around 800 people at various points, including soldiers, porters, and officers. What emerged on the other side, months later, was a fraction of that number. The deaths in the Ituri were caused by the same combination of forces that had devastated the 1876 expedition: disease, starvation, as food supplies ran out, and the column could not live off the forest as efficiently as they had hoped, and the physical toll of moving through terrain that offered no mercy to large, slow-moving groups. Several of Stanley's officers became separated from the main column during the Ituri passage, and spent months lost in the forest before being found or finding their way out. Edmund Musgrave Bartelot, who had been left in charge of the rear column at a base camp called Yambaya, was shot dead by one of his own men after a period of increasing psychological deterioration. The rear column waited at Yambuya for nearly a year, losing hundreds of men to disease while waiting for supplies and instructions that were delayed by the chaos of the forest. When the rear column finally attempted to follow Stanley's route through the Ituri, it had already lost so many people that it could barely function as a coherent unit. James Jameson, one of the officers of the rear column, died of fever before he could reach the other side. Herbert Ward, another officer, eventually made it out but left accounts of the Ituri passage that are among the most harrowing in the literature of African exploration. What makes the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition particularly instructive as an example of the Congo Basin's resistance to crossing is that it was not an underfunded or poorly organised venture. It was backed by significant financial resources, it had experienced leadership, and it had the benefit of Stanley's own prior experience in the basin. And yet the Ituri forest broke it in much the same way that the Congo River had broken the 1876 expedition. The specific mechanisms were somewhat different. The Ituri's density made movement slower, and the food situation was more acute because the forest's interior offered less accessible game and fewer riverside communities to trade with. But the underlying dynamic was identical. The forest imposed costs that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate or offset. There is something worth pausing on here, which is the question of what Stanley himself made of all this. He was not a man given to self-doubt in his published writings, and his accounts of both expeditions tend toward a tone of determined forward motion rather than reflection on the costs. But in private correspondence and in the less polished sections of his journals, there are moments where something more complicated comes through. He describes the Ituri as a place that seemed designed to defeat human movement. He uses the word darkness repeatedly, and not only in the literal sense of the forest's light-blocking canopy. There is a psychological dimension to the Ituri passage in his accounts that goes beyond physical description, a sense that the forest was doing something to the minds of the men inside it, not through any supernatural agency, but simply through the relentless pressure of disorientation, exhaustion, and the absence of any visual horizon or navigational landmark. Joseph Conrad, who travelled up the Congo River in 1890 on a steamboat, drew on this quality of the forest for Heart of Darkness, though his journey was along the river rather than through the interior. Conrad's Congo is not primarily a place of dramatic physical danger, though that is present. It is a place that disorients, that strips away the frameworks that travellers bring with them, that reveals the limits of European assumptions about control and knowledge. Whether or not one accepts Conrad's particular framing of that experience, and it has been extensively and rightly criticised for the way it renders African people as part of the landscape, rather than as full human subjects. The underlying observation about the forest's effect on the European explorers who entered it contains something real. The Congo Basin did not simply resist physical crossing, it resisted the entire set of assumptions that European exploration brought to it. Stanley's expeditions were the most famous of the early attempts to penetrate the basin, but they were not the only ones, and the pattern they established: significant resources, experienced leadership, enormous losses, partial or qualified success at enormous human cost, repeated itself in various forms throughout the late 19th century. Each expedition that tried to move through the basin in a sustained way encountered the same layered system of resistance: the terrain, the climate, the river, the biology, and the simple fact that the forest's scale overwhelmed the logistical capacity of any group trying to cross it as outsiders, from the outside, on the outside's terms. The lesson that the Victorian expeditions offered, had anyone been in a position to fully absorb it, was that the Congo Basin could not be crossed by force of will and organisation alone. It required a different relationship to the environment, slower, more patient, more local, more submissive to the forest's own logic of movement. The forest peoples who had lived in the basin for tens of thousands of years understood this, though their understanding was not framed in those terms. It was simply how life in the forest worked. But the expeditions of the 1870s and 1880s were not looking for a different relationship. They were looking for a route, a crossing, a line from one side to the other, and the forest, as it had been doing for millions of years, declined to provide one. What the colonial powers who arrived after Stanley took from his expeditions was not primarily this lesson. What they took was the apparent proof that the Congo Basin could, with sufficient effort and resources, be penetrated and exploited. The question they asked themselves was not whether to enter the forest, but how to build the infrastructure that would make sustained entry possible. The answer they came up with was roads and railways, and the attempt to build them through the Congo Basin is its own chapter in the story of the forest's resistance to human ambition. The railway came first. That is worth saying plainly. because it is easy to assume that roads preceded railways in colonial Africa the way they did in parts of Europe or North America, where wheeled transport had centuries of gradual development behind it. In the Congo Basin, the logic ran differently. The Belgian and British colonial interest that moved into the region in the wake of Stanley's expeditions understood almost immediately that the river, for all its power and reach, had a fatal interruption. The Livingston Falls, that long cascade of 32 cataracts stretching roughly 350 kilometres between Kinshasa and the river's mouth at Matadi, made the lower Congo unnavigable by steamboat. Everything coming in or going out of the interior had to be portaged around that stretch, carried overland by human labour across difficult terrain, and then loaded back onto boats at the other end. This was slow, expensive, and in the early colonial period it depended entirely on forced or coerced African labour under conditions that were brutal even by the standards of the era. The solution the colonial administration settled on was a railway. Not a road. A railway, because a road through that terrain would require constant maintenance, and could not carry the volume of goods that the colonial economy needed to move. The Matadi-Kinshasa Railway was begun in 1890 and completed in 1898, covering approximately 400 kilometres between the port at Matadi and the navigable river at Kinshasa. On a map, it looks like a modest engineering project. On the ground, it was something else entirely. The construction killed people at a rate that shocked even some of the colonial administrators who oversaw it. Estimates vary, and the records from that period are incomplete and often deliberately obscured, but historians have documented the deaths of thousands of workers during the 8 years of construction. Some estimates place the toll in the tens of thousands when accounting for the full labour system that fed the railway's construction. Workers were brought in from other parts of Africa, from the Caribbean, from West Africa, because local labour was insufficient or resistant, and because the conditions along the construction route were so lethal that turnover was constant. Malaria, dysentery, and the physical demands of cutting through rock and dense forest in near constant humidity and heat killed workers faster than they could be replaced. The forest along the lower Congo is not the deep interior swamp of the Cuvette Centrale, but it's still hot, wet, and biologically hostile, and the combination of those conditions with the brutal labour regime of King Leopold II's Congo Free State produced a humanitarian catastrophe that was largely invisible to the outside world at the time. Joseph Conrad arrived at Matadi in June 1890, just as construction was underway, and spent several days there before continuing upriver by steamboat. What he saw at Matadi and along the route of the railway construction went directly into heart of darkness. The figures of exhausted workers in the shade of trees, the sense of immense effort producing something that felt from the inside more like destruction than progress. Conrad was not a systematic observer or a political analyst, and his account is filtered through his own preoccupations and the limitations of his perspective. But the physical reality he was recording was accurate enough. The construction of the Matadi-Kinshasa Railway was costing lives at a rate that the colonial project was simply absorbing as an acceptable cost of doing business. The forest was not impressed by the railway, in the sense that the forest did not yield easily. Every kilometre required blasting through rock, bridging streams, cutting drainage channels, and laying track on ground that was actively trying to become something else, something wetter, softer, more overgrown. When the railway was finally completed in 1898, it was genuinely transformative for the colonial economy. Goods could now move between the coast and the navigable upper river without the months-long portage that had previously made interior exploitation so slow and expensive. Steamboats on the upper Congo could reach Kisangani, then called Stanleyville, and from there the tributary rivers opened up the interior in a way that had not been possible before. The rubber and ivory trades accelerated dramatically. The extraction economy that Conrad had witnessed in its early and chaotic phase became more systematic and more efficient, which in the context of Leopold's Congo Free State meant that the violence and coercion that sustained it also became more systematic. But the railway solved only one problem. It bypassed the Livingston Falls, and it connected the coast to the navigable river, but it did not penetrate the interior. The vast basin beyond Kinshasa, the swamp forests, the tributary mazes, the Cuvette Centrale, remained as resistant to movement as it had always been, and so the colonial administration turned its attention to roads. The Belgian colonial road-building program of the early 20th century was ambitious in its conception, and genuinely impressive in some of its engineering. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Belgian Congo had one of the more extensive road networks in sub-Saharan Africa, at least on paper. The Route Nationale 1, which was intended to serve as the main overland artery connecting Kinshasa with the interior, was built in sections over several decades. Other routes pushed into the forest from different directions, following river valleys where possible, bridging tributaries, and cutting through forest where the terrain allowed. The problem was not building the roads. The problem was keeping them. The Congo Basin's climate does not treat infrastructure as a neutral object. It treats it as organic matter, which is to say, as something that can be broken down, absorbed, and eventually returned to the soil. A road surface in the Congo Basin faces rainfall that can exceed 2,000 millimeters per year in some areas, concentrated into rainy seasons that turn laterite and clay surfaces into deep mud. Tree roots, which in the Congo's forest grow with remarkable speed and force, push through road surfaces from below. Vegetation closes in from the sides. Drainage channels fill with silt and debris. Bridges over small streams rot or are undercut by seasonal flooding. In temperate climates, a road that is not maintained for a few years becomes overgrown and potholed. In the Congo Basin, a road that is not maintained for a few years can become effectively impassable, and a road that is not maintained for a decade can become difficult to find. The colonial administration understood this, which is why road maintenance was a constant and expensive priority throughout the Belgian colonial period. Thousands of Congolese workers were employed, often under compulsory labour arrangements, specifically to maintain roads that had already been built, clearing vegetation, repairing surfaces, maintaining drainage. These were ongoing tasks, not one-time projects. The roads existed in a state of continuous contest with the forest, and the forest was patient in a way that colonial budgets were not. Even with that maintenance effort, many roads in the interior were seasonal at best. During the rainy season, large sections became impassable to wheeled vehicles. Travel that was possible in the dry season became impossible when the rains arrived, and the transition between the two was not always predictable. Truck convoys that set out in reasonable conditions could find themselves stranded when an unexpected early rain turned a passable surface into something resembling a riverbed. The forest's relationship to time and season was not the same as a road planner's relationship to time and season, and the two systems were in constant low-grade conflict. By the 1950s, as Congolese independence began to seem like a real political possibility, rather than a distant abstraction, the road network of the Belgian Congo was functional but fragile. It worked because an enormous and expensive maintenance apparatus kept it working. What was less visible at the time, or perhaps less discussed, was how quickly that fragility would become apparent if the maintenance apparatus were disrupted. The disruption came with independence in 1960, and it came faster than almost anyone had anticipated. The political chaos of the early independence period, the secession of Katanga, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the intervention of Belgian forces and later UN peacekeepers, and the general collapse of administrative continuity, meant that road maintenance fell apart almost immediately in many areas. The colonial road crews were disbanded or dispersed. The administrative structures that had coordinated maintenance work ceased to function in most of the interior, and the forest, which had been waiting with the patience of something that measures time in centuries rather than years, began to move back in. The process was not dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, incremental, and easy to miss if you were not watching closely. A drainage channel would fill with debris and not be cleared. The the water would begin to undercut the road surface beside it. A section of surface would become soft during the next rainy season and would not be repaired. Vehicles would begin to avoid that section, cutting a new track through the vegetation alongside it. The new track would itself become soft, and another track would form beside it, and within a few years what had been a maintained road surface would have become a braided network of muddy tracks surrounded by encroaching vegetation, none of which was reliably passable. This pattern repeated itself across hundreds of kilometres of the interior road network throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. By the 1970s, under Mobutu Sese Seko's government, which had renamed the country Zaire in 1971, the interior road network had already been reduced to a fraction of its colonial-era functionality. Mobutu's government was not primarily interested in infrastructure maintenance. It was interested in extracting revenue from the country's mineral wealth, concentrating power in Kinshasa, and maintaining the loyalty of key military and political figures. Road maintenance in the interior of the Cuvette Centrale was not a political priority, and it showed. The Route Nationale 1, which had been intended as the spine of interior connectivity, was by the late 1970s already functionally impassable in many of its interior sections during the rainy season, and increasingly difficult even in the dry season as years of deferred maintenance accumulated. There is something almost instructive about this, in a grim way. The colonial road network had been built on the assumption that the maintenance effort required to sustain it would be a permanent feature of Congolese governance, that whoever controlled the country would have both the resources and the interest to keep the roads open. That assumption turned out to be wrong, and the forest response to being wrong was swift and comprehensive. Within 20 years of independence, the forest had reclaimed enough of the road network to make overland travel through the interior of the basin genuinely difficult. Within 30 years, it had reclaimed enough to make such travel effectively impossible in many areas without specialized equipment, significant time, and a considerable tolerance for uncertainty. The Matadi-Kinshasa railway fared somewhat better, because a railway is harder to reclaim than a road. The steel rails and stone ballast resist the forest's advances more effectively than a laterite road surface. But even the railway suffered from years of deferred maintenance and political instability. By the 1990s, the railway was running intermittently at best, with equipment that was decades old and infrastructure that had not been properly maintained in years. The colonial-era solution to the Livingstone Falls problem was still technically in place, but it was operating at a fraction of its original capacity. What the collapse of the colonial road network revealed, in a way that the colonial period itself had somewhat obscured, was a simple underlying truth about the Congo Basin. The forest's resistance to human infrastructure is not a problem that can be solved once and then set aside. It is a condition that requires continuous, expensive, and sustained effort to manage. And even then, the management is only partial. The forest is not defeated by roads and railways. It is temporarily held back by them, and it resumes its work the moment the holding back effort relaxes. This is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. It is a practical engineering and ecological reality. The Congo Basin's combination of rainfall, humidity, temperature, biological activity, and hydrological dynamism creates an environment in which the degradation of infrastructure is not an occasional problem, but a constant process. Fungi break down wooden components, roots crack concrete and tarmac. Seasonal flooding shifts road surfaces and undermines bridge foundations. The sheer volume of organic material falling from the forest canopy clogs drainage systems. Every element of the infrastructure is under continuous biological and hydrological pressure, and the pressure never stops. The colonial powers built roads into the Congo Basin because they believed that infrastructure was the way to make the forest productive on their terms. And for a period, under conditions of intensive maintenance and coerced labour, the roads functioned. But the forest terms were different. and the forest terms were longer. What the colonial road-building era ultimately demonstrated was not that the Congo Basin could be opened by infrastructure, but that infrastructure in the Congo Basin exists in a state of permanent negotiation with the environment, a negotiation in which the environment holds most of the cards and has no particular reason to make concessions. The roads and railways were not a conquest of the forest. They were a temporary arrangement, and the forest knew it even if the colonial administrators did not. The question of what happened when that arrangement ended, when the political and economic structures that sustained the maintenance effort collapsed, is the next part of this story. And that ending came, as endings of arrangements often do, not all at once, but in stages, each one making the next more difficult to reverse. The Democratic Republic of the Congo gained independence from Belgium on June 30th, 1960. The celebrations in Kinshasa were genuine and enormous. There was real hope in the air, real belief that what had been extracted and controlled for so long might now be shaped by the people who actually lived there. But the political transition that followed was almost immediately chaotic. Within weeks of independence, the Force Publique mutinied against its Belgian officers. The mineral-rich Katanga province declared secession. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, who had been one of the most compelling voices for a unified, independent Congo, was arrested, transferred to Katanga, and executed in January 1961, with the involvement of Belgian officials and, as later investigations established, the knowledge of the CIA. The United Nations sent peacekeeping forces. The country lurched through a series of governments and coups. By 1965, a military officer named Joseph Désiré Mobutu had taken control, and he would not let go for 32 years. What this meant for the interior of the Congo Basin was not immediately obvious. Political instability in a capital city does not automatically translate into forest reclaiming road surfaces. But the connection was real, and it operated through a fairly direct mechanism. Road maintenance in the Congo Basin requires money, equipment, labour, and coordination. It requires fuel for grading machines, spare parts for the machines when they break down, wages for workers, and some kind of administrative structure capable of organising all of it across enormous distances. When the colonial administration collapsed, the systems that had provided all of those things either disappeared or became severely degraded. The Belgian technical staff who had managed much of the road maintenance work left. The supply chains for equipment and parts became unreliable. The administrative structures that had coordinated maintenance work ceased to function in most of the interior. The first years were perhaps the most deceptive, because the roads that had been maintained up to 1960 did not immediately fall apart. Infrastructure has a kind of inertia. A well-built road surface can tolerate a year or two of reduced maintenance before the damage becomes serious. So in the early 1960s, the roads were still passable, still recognisable as roads, still doing something like what they were supposed to do. The deterioration was happening, but it was not yet visible enough to feel like a crisis. It felt more like a temporary problem, the kind of thing that would be sorted out once the political situation stabilised. The political situation did not stabilise in any way that helped the roads. By the mid-1960s, the damage was becoming harder to ignore. The section of Route Nationale, one that ran through the Cuvette Centrale, the vast interior depression where the peatlands and swamp forests sit, was particularly vulnerable because that stretch of road had always required the most intensive maintenance. The soil conditions in the interior basin are among the worst possible for road building. The peat and waterlogged clay that underlie much of the Cuvette Centrale do not provide stable foundations. They compress under load, shift with moisture changes, and offer almost no resistance to the lateral forces that heavy vehicles apply to road surfaces. The colonial engineers had known this, and had managed it through a combination of drainage works, surface grading, and constant attention. When the attention stopped, the drainage works began to fail, and the surface began to move. There is a specific pattern to how a road fails in this kind of environment, and it is worth describing because it explains why recovery is so difficult once the process begins. The first sign is usually standing water on or beside the road surface after rain. Water that would previously have been channeled away by functioning drainage ditches but now has nowhere to go. The standing water softens the surface material. Vehicles crossing the soft surface displace it, creating ruts. The ruts collect more water. The water deepens the ruts. Meanwhile, the vegetation at the road's edges, which had been cut back regularly by maintenance crews, begins to grow inward. The root systems of grasses and small plants work into the road surface, breaking it up from below. Larger plants follow. Within a single rainy season, a section of road that had been passable can become a series of muddy trenches surrounded by vegetation, and by the following dry season the vegetation has advanced far enough that the road's edges are no longer clearly defined. This is not a slow process in the Congo Basin. The combination of rainfall, temperature and biological activity means that vegetation can advance several meters in a single growing season. A road that is not actively maintained is not simply deteriorating, it is being actively colonized. The forest does not wait for an invitation. It moves into any available space with the same patient urgency that it brings to everything else. By the late 1970s, the situation along much of the interior road network had passed the point where simple maintenance could restore functionality. The roads had not just deteriorated, they had in many sections effectively ceased to exist as roads. What remained were tracks sometimes, or the memory of tracks, or local knowledge that a road had once run through a particular stretch of forest. Travellers who attempted the interior routes during this period left accounts that read less like travel writing and more like survival narratives. Vehicles would sink to their axles in mud and require hours of digging and improvised bridging to extract. Bridges that had once crossed tributaries were gone, replaced by nothing, leaving travellers to ford rivers that could be chest deep or deeper depending on the season. Sections of the route that had taken hours to drive in the colonial period were now taking days, if they could be crossed at all. The Kinshasa to Kisangani route is perhaps the clearest illustration of how complete this collapse became. Kisangani sits in the northeastern interior of the basin, roughly 1,700 kilometres from Kinshasa, by the most direct overland route. In the colonial period, this journey was difficult but achievable by road, at least in the dry season. By the 1980s, it had become effectively impossible overland. The roads that had connected the two cities through the interior had been reclaimed to the point where no vehicle, regardless of how capable, could reliably make the journey. The only practical route between Kinshasa and Kisangani had reverted to what it had been before the colonial road-building era, the river. And even the river, as we have already seen, is not a simple highway. The journey by river barge between Kinshasa and Kisangani, a journey of roughly 1,750 kilometres along the Congo and its upper reaches, takes between 2 and 6 weeks, depending on the season, the barge's condition, the water levels, and a range of other factors that are difficult to predict in advance. By the 1990s, the UN and international NGOs operating in the DRC had largely accepted a reality that the colonial administrators would have found almost incomprehensible, that the interior of the Congo Basin was not meaningfully accessible by land. The logistics of humanitarian operations, development projects, and scientific expeditions in the interior of the DRC are built around air transport in a way that reflects this directly. The UN's Humanitarian Air Service, UNHAS, operates a network of flights to interior locations in the DRC that would, in a country with functioning roads, be entirely unnecessary. A supply run that might take a day by road in a country with maintained infrastructure takes an hour by small aircraft in the DRC, but only because the road alternative has ceased to exist as a practical option. The air transport system is not a convenience, it is a necessity created by the forest's reclamation of the ground-level infrastructure. The cost of this situation is difficult to overstate, and it falls most heavily on the people who live in the interior. A bag of rice that costs a certain amount in Kinshasa can cost 3 or 4 times as much in an interior town, because the transport cost by river or air is enormous relative to the value of the goods. Medical supplies, construction materials, fuel and equipment all carry similar premiums. Communities that are cut off from the road network for weeks or months during the rainy season are cut off not just from goods, but from medical care, from markets, from the ability to sell what they produce or buy what they need. The forest's reclamation of the roads is not an abstract ecological phenomenon. It has direct daily consequences for millions of people. There have been periodic efforts to rebuild. The World Bank and various bilateral donors have funded road rehabilitation projects in the DRC at different points over the past 30 years. Some of these projects have produced real results in specific locations, particularly on sections of road close to Kinshasa or near major mining areas where the economic incentive for maintenance is strong. The road between Kinshasa and Matadi, for instance, the route that runs alongside the old Matadi-Kinshasa railway down to the Atlantic coast, has been rehabilitated multiple times and is in relatively better condition than the interior routes. But the interior routes, the ones that would need to be functional for a true crossing of the basin to be possible, have proven far more resistant to rehabilitation. The distances are greater, the terrain is more hostile, the maintenance burden is higher, and the economic incentive is weaker because the interior of the basin, unlike the mining regions or the Atlantic corridor, does not generate the kind of revenue that makes road maintenance feel like a worthwhile investment to the parties who control the money. There is also a deeper problem, one that goes beyond funding and political will. The colonial road network was built using methods, forced labour on a massive scale, administrative coercion, the extraction of resources from local populations to fund the maintenance effort, that are not available to, or at least not acceptable for, modern road-building efforts. The colonial roads were maintained at a cost that was largely invisible in the official accounts, because it was paid by the people living along the routes in the form of compulsory labour. When that system ended, the cost of maintaining the roads became visible, and the visible cost was enormous. Modern road rehabilitation projects in the DRC must pay market rates for labour, must import equipment and fuel at significant cost, must work within governance structures that are often fragmented and unreliable, and must somehow sustain the maintenance effort after the initial rehabilitation is complete. That last part, the sustained maintenance, is where most projects have struggled, because the political and economic conditions that would make sustained maintenance possible have not existed in the interior of the DRC for most of the post-independence period. What the post-independence collapse of the Congo Basin's road network ultimately reveals is something that the colonial period had temporarily obscured. The forest does not make exceptions for good intentions or adequate funding. It responds to physical conditions, not to political will. The physical conditions in the Congo Basin, the rainfall, the humidity, the biological activity, the hydrological dynamism, create a maintenance burden that is simply very high, higher than most comparable environments, and the burden is continuous. There is no point at which the maintenance effort can be reduced or paused without the forest immediately beginning to take back what was taken from it. This is not a counsel of despair exactly. Roads can be built in the Congo Basin, and some roads have been built and are functioning, but the idea that the interior of the basin can be opened by a one-time infrastructure investment, that roads can be built and then simply used without continuous, expensive and attentive maintenance, has been tested thoroughly by history and has been found to be wrong. The forest is patient in a way that human institutions rarely are. It does not get discouraged. It does not run out of funding. It does not change governments or shift priorities. It simply continues doing what it has been doing for tens of thousands of years, which is growing, spreading, decomposing and reclaiming. Every road that has been built into the interior of the Congo Basin has eventually encountered this patience, and most of them have lost the encounter. And yet, even with all of this, the collapsed roads, the impassable terrain, the river journeys measured in weeks rather than days, the air transport networks built to compensate for the absence of ground-level connectivity, there is still a tendency among outsiders to assume that the forest must have its own logic of movement, its own people who know how to navigate it, its own internal geography that makes crossing possible for those who belong to it. That assumption is understandable. It is also, in important ways, more complicated than it appears, and the story of the people who have lived in this forest for tens of thousands of years tells us something quite different from what most outsiders expect. The people who have lived longest in the Congo Basin are not the people who crossed it. They are the people who stopped trying to cross it, or perhaps never thought of it in those terms at all. The Mbuti of the Ituri Forest, the Aka and Baka of the Western Basin, the Baka of the Dzanga-Sangha region near what is now the Central African Republic. These communities have been present in the Congo Basin for somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 years, depending on the genetic evidence and how you interpret it. That is a span of time so large that it makes the entire history of European contact with the forest look like a brief footnote. And in all that time, what these communities developed was not a method for crossing the forest. What they developed was a method for living inside it. This is a distinction that sounds simple but carries a great deal of weight. When outsiders have imagined the possibility of crossing the Congo Basin, they have often imagined that local forest peoples must possess some form of navigational knowledge that makes the crossing possible for those who understand the forest well enough. It is a reasonable assumption on its face. If anyone knows how to move through this environment, surely it is the people who have lived in it for tens of thousands of years. But the assumption contains a misunderstanding about what kind of knowledge forest peoples actually have, and what that knowledge is designed to do. The Mbuti, for example, who were documented extensively by the anthropologist Colin Turnbull in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly in his 1961 book The Forest People, have a relationship with the Ituri forest that is extraordinarily intimate and specific. Their knowledge is not a general map of the forest. It is a deep layered familiarity with particular places, particular streams, particular fruiting trees, particular paths between seasonal camps, particular sections of forest where specific animals can be found at specific times of year. This knowledge is local in the most profound sense. It is knowledge of a home territory, not knowledge of a route through an unknown landscape. The Mbuti move within the forest the way a person moves through a house they have lived in for their entire life, not by following directions, but by inhabiting a space that has become as familiar as their own body. The seasonal movement patterns of Mbuti communities typically cover territories ranging from roughly 100 to several hundred square kilometres, depending on the group and the season. These are not small areas by any means, and moving through them requires real skill and physical endurance. But they are a tiny fraction of the 3.3 million square kilometres of the Congo Basin as a whole. The knowledge that allows a Mbuti community to thrive in the Ituri forest does not transfer automatically to the Cuvette Centrale, or to the swamp forests of the Western Basin, or to the gallery forests along the Kasai. Each of these zones has its own ecology, its own seasonal rhythms, its own specific dangers and resources. The forest is not a single thing that can be understood all at once. It is a vast collection of different local environments, each of which requires its own specific knowledge to navigate safely. The Biaka of the Dzanga-Sangha region, in what is now southwestern Central African Republic near the border with the Republic of Congo, offer another example of this kind of deeply localized forest knowledge. The Dzanga-Sangha forest is one of the better studied areas of the Western Congo Basin, partly because it contains the Dzangandoki National Park, and has been the site of long-term ecological research, including work by researchers like Andrea Turcalo, who spent decades studying the forest elephants that gather at the Dzangabai, a natural forest clearing. The Baka who live in and around this forest have knowledge of it that researchers have described as genuinely extraordinary. Knowledge of medicinal plants, of animal behaviour, of the subtle signs that indicate where forest elephants or bongo antelope might be moving, of the acoustic landscape of the forest, and what different sounds mean. This knowledge has taken generations to accumulate. It is passed down through practice and observation, not through any formal system. and it is inseparable from the specific landscape in which it developed. But the Beaka do not cross the Congo Basin. Their world is the Zanga-Sanga forest and its immediate surroundings. When Baka hunters move through the forest, they are moving through territory they know, with the kind of granular familiarity that comes from a lifetime of attention. When they reach the edge of that territory, they reach the edge of their reliable knowledge. Beyond that edge is not a different version of the same forest. It is effectively a different world, one that requires its own specific knowledge that they do not possess and have no particular reason to acquire. This is not a limitation in any negative sense. It is the natural shape of how human beings relate to landscapes when they are truly embedded in them. No community of any kind, anywhere in the world, has ever possessed detailed navigational knowledge of an entire continent. What forest peoples have is something far more valuable for the purposes of actually living. Intimate knowledge of a specific place, accumulated over many generations, refined and tested by continuous experience. The Mbuti knowledge of the Ituri forest is not a lesser version of some imagined comprehensive forest knowledge. It is a complete and sophisticated system for inhabiting a particular environment. The fact that it does not extend across the entire basin is not a gap in the knowledge. It is simply the shape of what the knowledge is. There is also a deeper point here, one that is easy to miss if you approach the forest from the outside with crossing in mind. The communities that have lived successfully in the Congo Basin for tens of thousands of years have done so by adapting their lives to the forest's logic, not by trying to impose a different logic on it. The forest peoples of the Congo Basin do not move the way outsiders move. They do not carry heavy loads of equipment designed for a different environment. They do not try to maintain a fixed pace or cover a predetermined distance each day. Their movement is responsive rather than planned, in the way that a crossing expedition would need to be planned. If a particular path becomes difficult because of seasonal flooding, they take a different path, or they wait. If resources are scarce in one area, they shift toward another area. The relationship between the community and the landscape is dynamic and mutual, not a matter of one imposing its will on the other. This responsiveness is itself a form of knowledge, and it is one of the most important reasons why forest peoples have been able to thrive in an environment that defeats outsiders. But it also means that their way of moving through the forest is not a method that can be borrowed and applied to a crossing expedition. A crossing expedition has a destination, a timeline, a fixed starting point and end point. It is committed to covering a certain distance in a certain direction. The forest peoples of the Congo Basin have none of these constraints. Their movement is shaped by the forest's own rhythms, not by an external agenda. That flexibility is precisely what makes their relationship with the forest sustainable, and it is precisely what a crossing attempt cannot replicate. There have been occasions in the history of exploration and research in the Congo Basin when outsiders have hired forest peoples as guides, hoping to benefit from their navigational knowledge. Stanley's expeditions made use of local guides in various forms, as did many of the colonial-era scientific and administrative expeditions that followed. These arrangements sometimes helped, and sometimes did not. The difficulty was exactly what you might expect. A guide who knows one section of the forest intimately may have very little useful knowledge of a section 50 kilometers away. The forest is too large and too varied for any individual or community to hold a comprehensive map of it in their heads. A guide from the Ituri forest is not necessarily more useful than a well-prepared outsider when both of them are standing in an unfamiliar section of the Cuvette Centrale swamps. There is also a social and political dimension to this that tends to get overlooked. The forest peoples of the Congo Basin have their own relationships with the landscapes they inhabit, their own territorial understandings, their own reasons for not venturing into certain areas. The idea that local forest knowledge is simply available to be accessed by outsiders with the right approach underestimates the complexity of the social arrangements that govern movement in the forest. Different communities have different relationships with different territories, and those relationships are not always transparent to outsiders or easily navigated by them. The Akar, who live across a broad area of the Western Basin in the Republic of Congo and the Central African Republic, have been studied by researchers including Sima Arom, and later by teams interested in their musical traditions and their ecological knowledge. Like the Mbuti and the Beaka, the Akar are semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers whose movement patterns are tied to the seasonal availability of resources in specific areas. Their knowledge is sophisticated and real, and it has allowed them to live in the forest for an enormous span of time. But their knowledge is also, like all human knowledge, bounded by experience and geography. It is the knowledge of people who belong to a place, not people who traverse a continent. What the existence of these communities ultimately reveals about the Congo Basin is something quite different from what outsiders often hope to find. The forest is not uncrossable because it lacks people who understand it. It is not waiting for the right guide or the right technique. The forest peoples who have lived in it for tens of thousands of years have arrived at the same practical conclusion that the Victorian explorers, the Belgian colonial engineers, the post-independence road builders, and the modern-age logistics planners have all arrived at through very different routes. The Congo Basin is not a place that rewards the idea of crossing. It is a place that rewards the idea of belonging, and belonging in this context means something specific and demanding. It means learning one small part of the forest deeply enough to live within it, moving with its rhythms rather than against them, accepting its terms rather than trying to negotiate different ones. The communities that have done this successfully are among the most remarkable examples of long-term human adaptation anywhere on Earth. They have developed pharmacopoeias from forest plants that Western science is still working to understand. They have developed hunting techniques and tracking skills that allow them to move through dense forest, with a quietness and efficiency that outsiders find genuinely difficult to believe until they witness it. They have developed social structures and cultural practices that are specifically shaped by the demands of forest life, by the need for flexibility, for sharing, for responsiveness to conditions that can change rapidly and unpredictably. None of this is primitive or simple. It is the result of tens of thousands of years of careful, attentive, practical learning. But even this learning, this extraordinary depth of accumulated knowledge, does not produce a crossing of the Congo Basin. It produces something else. A way of being in the forest that is sustainable and rich and deeply human, but that is fundamentally local. The forest peoples of the Congo Basin are not evidence that the forest can be crossed by those who know it well enough. They are evidence that the forest can be inhabited by those who accept its terms completely, and accepting its terms completely means, among other things, giving up the idea of crossing it in any comprehensive sense. This is the quiet lesson that the human geography of the Congo Basin offers, and it is one that tends to complicate the outsider narrative of exploration and discovery. The people who belong to this forest have not failed to cross it. They have simply understood, through long experience, that crossing is not the right question to ask of it. The right question is how to live within it, and to that question they have found answers of extraordinary depth and precision. It is the outsider's question. How do you get from one side to the other? That the forest consistently refuses to answer on the outsider's terms. And it is that refusal, operating simultaneously at the level of physical geography, climate, biology, infrastructure, and now human knowledge itself, that brings us to the question of what happens when modern travellers, equipped with satellite phones and GPS devices and the full logistical support of the 21st century, actually try to put the crossing question to the forest directly. And so that question has been asked, in various forms by various people, over the past few decades. Not the Victorian explorers with their columns of porters and their imperial ambitions, and not the colonial engineers with their survey equipment and their labour gangs, but modern travellers, people with access to GPS coordinates and satellite communication, and lightweight waterproof gear and anti-malarial prophylactics, and, in some cases, the full logistical backing of television production companies. People who knew, going in, exactly what they were attempting and roughly what the obstacles would be. The results of these modern attempts are instructive, and they are instructive not because the travellers failed dramatically, in the way that Stanley's expeditions failed dramatically, but because they failed quietly, practically, and for reasons that feel almost mundane once you understand the forest's logic. Levison Wood is a British explorer and writer who has made a career of long-form journeys through difficult terrain, walking the length of the Nile, travelling through the Himalayas, documenting these journeys for television and in books. In 2015, he undertook a journey along the Congo River, which he documented in a series for Channel 4 and in a subsequent book. It is worth being precise about what that journey was, because the distinction matters enormously in the context of crossing the basin. Wood travelled by boat along the river, not overland through the forest. He moved through the DRC on the water, which is, as we have already established, the only thing approaching a viable route through the interior. Even travelling by river, the journey was not straightforward. Wood encountered the expected combination of bureaucratic obstruction, logistical breakdown, security concerns, and the sheer grinding difficulty of moving through a region where infrastructure is either absent or unreliable. There were delays that stretched days into weeks. There were moments where forward movement depended entirely on the goodwill of people he had just met and had no particular reason to trust him. There were sections of river where the boat he was travelling on broke down and the timeline simply dissolved. He described the experience in various interviews as one of the most genuinely difficult journeys he had undertaken, and he had, by that point, walked 4,000 miles along the Nile. The river journey, the water-based route that represents the closest thing to a passable corridor through the Congo Basin, was still that hard. The forest, in other words, does not become easy simply because you have found the right mode of transport. The overland question is starker. In 2013, a British adventurer named Phil Harwood attempted to travel overland through the Democratic Republic of Congo, aiming to cover significant ground through the interior by road and track. The attempt was abandoned. The reasons were layered, as they always are in the Congo. Road conditions that made forward progress effectively impossible in certain sections, combined with security concerns that made attempting to push through those sections genuinely dangerous. This is not a story of dramatic failure or near-death experience. It is a quieter story, which in some ways is more telling. Harwood was not underprepared or naive about the difficulty. He understood what he was attempting. The forest and the political reality around it simply presented conditions that made continuation impossible, and he made the rational decision to stop. That rational decision, made by a prepared and experienced traveller with modern equipment and a realistic understanding of the terrain, is itself a kind of answer to the crossing question. There is a body of documented experience from aid workers, journalists and researchers who have attempted the overland route between Kisangani and Kinshasa, a distance of roughly 1,700 kilometres that, on a map, looks like it ought to be manageable. Kisangani sits in the northeastern interior of the DRC, at the upper end of the navigable Congo River. Kinshasa sits at the western edge of the country, near the river's lower reaches before the Livingstone Falls make further downstream navigation impossible. Between these two cities there is no continuously passable road. There is no highway. There is a river, and there are sections of track that exist in various states of disrepair and seasonal inundation. Journalists covering the DRC in the 1990s and 2000s documented overland travel in that region, taking weeks or months for distances that should theoretically take days. The accounts describe roads that simply end, not at a junction or a bridge, but in the forest, where the vegetation has grown back over the track and the track has become indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. They describe river crossings where the ferry is a dugout canoe, or where there is no ferry at all, and you wait on the bank until someone with a boat appears, which might be tomorrow or might be next week. They describe the particular exhaustion of moving through terrain where every kilometre requires a decision, and every decision might be wrong. The river barge route between Kinshasa and Kisangani, which we will look at more closely a little later, typically takes between 2 and 6 weeks in each direction, depending on the season, the condition of the barge, and the number of stops. That is the water route, which is the best route. In the 1990s, during periods of political instability and conflict, even this route was sometimes suspended entirely, leaving the interior effectively cut off from the capital for months at a time. Aid organisations operating in the DRC have long relied on air transport for the movement of personnel and critical supplies, precisely because the surface routes are too unreliable to depend on. The UN's Humanitarian Air Service, UNHAS, operates extensively in the DRC, flying routes that would be straightforward road trips in most other countries, but are functionally impossible on the ground. This is not a temporary workaround or a response to a recent crisis. It is the standard operating model for humanitarian logistics in the Congo Basin, and it has been for decades. What is particularly striking about the modern attempts to cross or traverse the basin is how little the availability of modern technology has changed the fundamental situation. A GPS device tells you exactly where you are, which is genuinely useful. It does not drain the swamp in front of you, or rebuild a road that has been swallowed by the forest, or negotiate passage through an area controlled by an armed group that has no particular interest in letting you through. A satellite phone allows you to communicate with the outside world from the interior of the forest, which is a real improvement over the Victorian situation. It does not change the fact that if your vehicle breaks down in a section of track 3 days from the nearest settlement, the satellite phone can summon help, but help may still take a very long time to arrive. The modern traveller in the Congo Basin has better information and better communication than any previous generation of outsiders. The forest has not changed, the swamps have not changed, the rainfall has not changed, the rivers have not changed. The gap between what the technology promises and what the terrain delivers remains essentially as wide as it has always been. There is one specific claim that is worth examining carefully, because it comes up often in discussions of Congo crossings. The claim that no verified continuous overland crossing of the full basin has ever been documented. This is a claim that requires some precision. The Congo Basin covers 3.3 million square kilometres across 6 countries. A crossing, in the most literal sense, would mean travelling from one edge of the basin to the other entirely on the ground, without relying on river transport for any significant portion of the route. By that standard, the claim appears to hold. There are accounts of people who have travelled extensively through the DRC and the surrounding countries on the ground. There are accounts of missionaries, researchers, traders and adventurers who have covered remarkable distances in the interior, but a continuous, documented, verifiable overland crossing of the full basin, the kind of journey that would be the equivalent of walking across the Amazon on dry land, does not appear in the record. This is not a small gap in the documentation. It is a significant absence, and it reflects something real about the physical conditions of the basin, rather than simply a lack of adventurous people willing to try. The closest comparisons are instructive. The Amazon basin has been crossed overland, with enormous difficulty by various expeditions. But the Amazon has geographic features that the Congo does not. Elevations that create natural corridors, a different distribution of swamp and forest, and in some areas a dry season severe enough to make ground travel genuinely possible. The Congo's Cuvette Centrale, the vast interior depression that sits at the heart of the basin, has no real equivalent in the Amazon. It is a permanent swamp system covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometres, and it sits directly in the path of any east-west crossing attempt. Going around it means adding enormous distances and passing through terrain that presents its own set of difficulties. Going through it means travelling through flooded forest and peatland that is, in practical terms, impassable on foot or by vehicle. There have been moments, reading through the accounts of modern travellers in the Congo, where you get a sense of something that is hard to name precisely. A kind of recalibration that happens when a person who is used to being able to move through the world relatively freely encounters a place that simply will not cooperate. It is not fear, exactly, and it is not defeat exactly. It is more like the slow recognition that the assumptions you brought with you do not apply here, and that applying them harder will not help. Levison Wood described something like this in his account of the Congo journey. So did various journalists and aid workers who have written about their time in the interior. The forest does not argue with you. It does not explain itself. It simply continues to be what it is, and what it is turns out to be more than most modern frameworks for understanding difficult terrain are equipped to handle. What this accumulation of modern experience ultimately suggests is that the Congo Basin's resistance to crossing is not a problem waiting to be solved by the right combination of equipment, planning, and determination. It is a structural condition produced by the interaction of geography, climate, biology, infrastructure collapse, and political instability, each of which would be a significant obstacle on its own, and all of which exist simultaneously in the same place. The Victorian explorers encountered the physical and biological layers. The colonial engineers encountered the infrastructure layer. The post-independence era revealed the political and governance layer. Modern travellers encounter all of these layers at once, with better tools for understanding what they are facing, but without any better means of actually changing it. This is, in a quiet way, a remarkable thing. We live in an era when most of the planet's surface has been mapped, photographed and catalogued to a degree that would have been unimaginable a century ago. We have satellites that can resolve objects less than a metre across from orbit. We have submersibles that can reach the deepest points of the ocean floor. We have sent instruments to the surface of Mars, and in the middle of the African continent there is a forest covering 3.3 million square kilometres that modern, well-equipped, well-informed travellers still cannot cross overland in any documented, continuous, verified way. That fact sits quietly in the record, not as a challenge or a provocation, but simply as a description of what the Congo Basin is and what it does to the idea of crossing. The political dimension of this impossibility, though, is something that the physical geography alone cannot fully explain. The forest is hard to cross because of what the land is, but it is also hard to cross in the modern era because of what has happened to the people and the governments and the armed groups that now occupy its edges and its interior. And that layer of the story is in some ways the most complicated and the most difficult to sit with. The political layer is not separate from the physical one. That is the first thing worth understanding about it. The two are woven together in the Congo Basin in ways that make it difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. The forest creates the conditions for ungoverned space. Ungoverned space creates the conditions for armed conflict. Armed conflict makes the forest more dangerous to enter, and the danger makes governance harder to establish. It is a loop, and it has been running in various forms for a long time. To understand the current situation, it helps to go back briefly to the 1990s, because that decade produced consequences that are still playing out in the eastern Congo today. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 sent roughly 2 million people across the border into what was then Zaire, a wave of refugees that included not just civilians but also members of the Interahamwe militia and elements of the Rwandan armed forces responsible for the killing. They settled in camps in eastern Zaire near the border, and they did not disarm. The Zairean state, already collapsing under the weight of Mobutu Sese Seko's decades of kleptocratic misrule, had no meaningful capacity to manage this. What followed was a cascade. The First Congo War from 1996 to 1997, the Second Congo War from 1998 to 2003, which drew in 9 African nations and is sometimes called Africa's World War, and then a long grinding post-war period that has never quite become peace. The Second Congo War is estimated to have caused somewhere between 3 and 5 million deaths, making it the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. Most of those deaths were not from direct combat. They were from disease, displacement, and starvation, the secondary consequences of a war fought across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, in a country where the infrastructure for healthcare and food distribution was already almost non-existent. The forest did not cause the war, but the forest shaped it. It provided cover for armed groups. It made supply lines nearly impossible to establish. It slowed down the movement of any conventional military force while allowing smaller, more mobile groups to melt into the trees and disappear. By the time the formal war ended in 2003, the Eastern Congo had fractured into a patchwork of territories controlled by different armed factions, some of them with explicit political or ethnic agendas, some of them operating more like criminal enterprises with guns, and many of them somewhere in between. The peace agreement that ended the Second Congo War created a transitional government and eventually led to elections, but it did not dissolve the armed groups. They adapted, they persisted. And in the years that followed, new ones formed. As of the early 2020s, Eastern DRC hosts somewhere between 100 and 200 distinct armed groups, depending on how you count them and how you define the term. Some are large enough to hold territory and operate checkpoints. Some are small enough to be essentially local bandit organisations. The most significant ones have names that appear regularly in UN reports and news coverage. The FDLR, the Forces Démocratiques de Libération du Rwanda, which is the successor organisation to some of the Rwandan Hutu militias that fled into the Congo in 1994 and has been operating in the forest for 3 decades now. The ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, originally a Ugandan Islamist insurgency that has been active in eastern DRC since the 1990s and has been linked in more recent years to the Islamic State network. And M23, the Mouvement du 23 Mars, a Tutsi-led rebel group that was defeated in 2013, reconstituted itself around 2021, and by 2022 and 2023 had captured significant territory in North Kivu province, including areas near the city of Goma. These are not abstract designations on a map. They translate directly into what it means to move through the Eastern Congo. Moving through territory controlled by or contested between armed groups means navigating checkpoints that may or may not be official, encountering fighters who may or may not be affiliated with any identifiable organisation, and operating in areas where the rules of engagement, if that phrase even applies, are unclear and can change without notice. For a traveller attempting to move overland through the basin, the eastern approaches are among the most logical entry points geographically, because the terrain is somewhat higher and less permanently flooded than the interior. But politically and in terms of security, the Eastern Congo is one of the most dangerous places on Earth to be a stranger moving through unfamiliar territory. The numbers on violence against aid workers and journalists in this region are sobering. The DRC has consistently ranked among the most dangerous countries in the world for humanitarian workers. Médecins Sans Frontières has had staff killed and abducted in the region on multiple occasions. The UN has lost peacekeepers in the Congo in larger numbers than almost any other peacekeeping operation in the world. The MONUSCO mission, which has operated in the DRC since 1999, has suffered hundreds of fatalities. Journalists covering the conflict have been killed, most notably perhaps the Italian ambassador Luca Attanasio and his bodyguard, who were killed in an ambush in North Kivu in February 2021 while travelling in a UN convoy. A reminder that even official escorted movement in the region carries real risk. What this means for any hypothetical crossing of the basin is not just that the eastern approaches are dangerous, though they are. It is that the danger is not geographically contained. The armed groups in the Eastern Congo are not static. They move. They follow resources, minerals, timber, charcoal, bushmeat, and the taxation of trade routes. The Ituri forest, which sits in the northeastern part of the basin and which Stanley's expedition traversed so catastrophically in the 1880s, remains an active conflict zone. Ituri province has experienced repeated cycles of ethnic violence and armed group activity, with a significant escalation beginning around 2017 and continuing into the early 2020s. The Maniema province, which sits in the interior of the country and would be a natural corridor for any east-west overland crossing, is less severely affected than the eastern border provinces but is not peaceful either. It has its own history of armed group activity and its own governance gaps. The governance gap is worth pausing on, because it is easy to misunderstand what it means in practice. When analysts and UN reports describe large portions of eastern and central DRC as effectively ungoverned, they do not mean that nothing is happening there or that no one is in charge. They mean that the Congolese state, its courts, its police, its administrative apparatus, its ability to enforce laws and protect civilians is functionally absent over enormous areas. What exists in its place is a complex, often violent negotiation among armed groups, local community leaders, customary authorities, and the various international organizations that operate in the region. It is not chaos in the sense of random disorder. It is a different kind of order, one that operates according to its own rules. But those rules are not transparent to outsiders. They change, and they are enforced with violence. For a traveller, this matters enormously. In a country with functioning governance, a traveller who encounters a problem, a broken vehicle, a medical emergency, a misunderstanding with a local official, has recourse. There are systems to appeal to. In the ungoverned spaces of the Eastern Congo, there are no such systems. What there is instead is the immediate local negotiation of whatever situation you find yourself in, with no institutional backstop. This is manageable if you have deep local knowledge, long-established relationships, and the right intermediaries. It is extremely difficult if you are a stranger moving through territory you do not know, trying to cross a place that no one has successfully crossed before. There is also the question of what the armed groups are actually doing in the forest, beyond fighting. Many of them are engaged in the extraction of the Congo Basin's mineral wealth. Coltan, gold, casterite, wolframite, and in the taxation of trade routes through the forest. The Eastern Congo sits on top of one of the most mineral-rich geological formations on Earth, and the armed groups that control access to those minerals have strong economic incentives to maintain their presence and to control who moves through their territory. A stranger crossing the forest is, from this perspective, not simply a traveller. They're a potential source of revenue, a potential intelligence asset for a rival group, or a potential threat. The incentives for armed groups to engage with outsiders moving through their territory are not friendly ones. It is worth being clear about what this does and does not mean. The Eastern Congo is not uniformly dangerous in every square kilometre. There are cities, towns and communities where daily life continues, where markets operate, where children go to school, where people live with a degree of normalcy that the international coverage of the region rarely captures. Goma, the major city in North Kivu, has restaurants and hotels and a university. Kisangani, the largest city in the interior of the country, functions as a commercial hub. The Congo is not simply a war zone in the way that phrase is sometimes used to flatten complex places into simple categories, but the specific challenge of crossing the basin overland, of moving continuously through the interior, through the Ituri and the Cuvette Centrale, and the forests of Maniema and Kasai, requires passing through precisely those areas where governance is weakest and armed group presence is strongest. The route that the geography suggests is the most plausible for a crossing is also the route that passes through the most politically compromised terrain. This is not a coincidence. The forest's inaccessibility has made it attractive to armed groups, for the same reason it has made it resistant to crossing. It is hard for states to project power into it, which means it is hard for anyone to enforce anything there. There is a particular cruelty to this dynamic when you consider it from the perspective of the Congolese civilians who live in these areas. The forest's resistance to crossing is also a resistance to the arrival of help. When violence breaks out in a remote area of eastern DRC, the same terrain that makes it nearly impossible for an adventurer to cross the basin makes it nearly impossible for humanitarian organizations to reach affected communities quickly. The roads that do not exist for a traveller also do not exist for an ambulance or a supply convoy. The rivers that take weeks to navigate by barge also take weeks to navigate when someone is trying to evacuate wounded civilians. The political instability that makes the region dangerous to enter also makes it dangerous for aid workers to operate in once they arrive. The layers of impossibility compound each other in ways that fall most heavily on the people who have the fewest options. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the political dimension of the Congo's resistance to crossing. It is not experienced equally. For an adventurer or an explorer, the impossibility of crossing the Congo Basin is a problem of ambition, a challenge that cannot be met, a record that cannot be set. For the people who live in the interior of the basin, the same impossibility is a daily condition of life, shaping access to markets, medical care, education, and physical safety in ways that have no equivalent in the lives of people who live in connected, governed places. The forest that is fascinating to contemplate from the outside is also the forest that makes it possible for armed groups to operate with impunity and for states to abandon their obligations to their citizens without consequence. None of this is to say that the Congo Basin's problems are caused by the forest. The political history of the DRC, the colonial extraction, the Cold War proxy politics, the kleptocracy, the wars, has human causes and human perpetrators, and blaming the geography would be both inaccurate and evasive. But the geography has shaped what was possible and what was not, in ways that have mattered at every stage of that history. The forest made the colonial extraction of rubber and ivory logistically brutal. The river system shaped where colonial power was concentrated and where it was absent. The terrain made the post-independence wars harder to end and easier to sustain. And today, the same physical conditions that made the Congo Basin nearly impossible to cross in Stanley's time continue to make it nearly impossible to govern, which makes it nearly impossible to secure, which makes it nearly impossible to cross. What the political layer adds to the story of the Congo's resistance, then, is not simply another obstacle to add to the list. It is a demonstration of how the physical and the human become entangled over time, each reinforcing the other until the forest and the conflict and the governance collapse feel like a single unified condition rather than separate problems. Understanding the Congo Basin requires holding all of these layers simultaneously. The peat and the rainfall and the sets fly alongside the armed groups and the collapsed roads and the absent state, and recognizing that they are not independent of each other. They are, in a real sense, the same story told from different angles, and there is still more to the story. Because even as human beings have struggled to move through the Congo Basin, and even as political forces have made that struggle more dangerous, the scientific understanding of what the forest actually contains, what lives there, what it stores, what processes it sustains, has remained startlingly incomplete. The interior of the Congo Basin has been, in some ways, as resistant to scientific investigation as it has been to physical crossing, and what researchers have discovered when they have managed to reach it has consistently surprised them. Consider for a moment how strange it is that we can image the surface of Mars in extraordinary detail. The individual rocks, the ancient riverbeds, the layered sediment walls of craters that have not seen liquid water for billions of years. And yet the interior of a forest on our own planet remains in meaningful ways scientifically unmapped. The Congo Basin is not a distant world. It sits within a few hours of flight from major African cities. Researchers have been studying it in various ways for well over a century, and still, in 2017, a team of scientists announced the discovery of one of the largest tropical peatland systems on Earth, hidden inside the basin's interior, previously uncharacterized by science. The scale of what had been missed is almost difficult to absorb. The Cuvette Centrale peatlands, as they came to be called, cover approximately 145,000 square kilometres, an area roughly the size of England and Wales combined, and they had simply not been formally described before. Not because no one had looked exactly, but because looking, in the Congo Basin, is genuinely hard in ways that are easy to underestimate. The team that made the discovery was led by Simon Lewis and Greta Dargy, researchers from the University of Leeds and University College London. What they found was not just an enormous area of peat, though that alone would have been significant, but a carbon store of remarkable density. The Cuvette Centrale peatlands are estimated to hold approximately 30 billion tonnes of carbon, which is roughly equivalent to 3 years of the entire world's fossil fuel emissions. That number had been sitting in the middle of the Congo Basin, unaccounted for in global carbon models because the terrain was too difficult to survey on the ground and too obscured from above to characterize accurately by satellite alone. The work required by Dagi and her colleagues to confirm the peatlands involved years of field work in some of the most physically demanding conditions imaginable. Wading through swamp forests, taking core samples from waterlogged ground, navigating the interior river systems by small boat. It was not a discovery made from a desk or a satellite feed. It required people physically present in the landscape, enduring what the landscape demands of anyone who enters it. This is part of what makes the scientific incompleteness of the Congo Basin so interesting. It is not primarily a failure of technology. Remote sensing has improved enormously over the past few decades, and researchers do use satellite data extensively in studying the basin. But there are specific practical limits to what can be learned from above, and the Congo's particular combination of conditions pushes against several of them at once. The forest canopy is dense enough that LIDAR, light detection and ranging, the laser-based remote sensing technology that has revolutionized archaeology and forest mapping in other parts of the world, struggles to penetrate to the ground surface in many areas. LIDAR works by firing rapid pulses of laser light and measuring how they bounce back, building a three-dimensional picture of what lies beneath the canopy. In less dense forests, enough pulses reach the ground to construct a usable picture. In the Congo's closed canopy interior, the returns from the ground are sparse and often unreliable. You can see the top of the forest very well. What happens below the canopy layer, and especially at ground level, remains difficult to resolve. Cloud cover compounds the problem. The Congo Basin's near equatorial position and its extraordinary humidity mean that the region is covered by cloud for a significant portion of the year. Optical satellite imagery, the kind that produces the visible light images that most people are familiar with, requires clear sky to work. In the Congo interior, clear sky is not reliably available. Researchers working with satellite data often have to stitch together images from many different passes over many different dates to assemble a picture without gaps, and even then, certain areas remain persistently obscured. Radar-based satellites can see through cloud cover, but they have their own resolution limitations and are less effective for certain kinds of ecological characterization. The result is that scientific understanding of the basin's interior has been built up slowly, patchily, and with significant uncertainty still embedded in the data. What this means in practice is that the Congo Basin continues to produce genuine scientific surprises. The Lasula is one of the more striking examples. Cercopithecus lomamiensis, the Lasula monkey, was formally described to science in 2012. It is not a small or cryptic animal. It is a medium-sized Old World monkey with a distinctive face, large eyes, and a bare patch of blue skin on its hindquarters that is visible from a reasonable distance. Local people in the Lomami basin of the DRC had known about it for years, obviously. It was not unknown to the communities living near it, but it had never been formally characterized by the scientific community, never given a Latin name, never entered into the global record of described species. The team that formally described it, led by John and Therese Hart through the TL2 project, named for the Chwapa, Lomami and Lualaba rivers, had been working in the Lomami Basin specifically because the area was so poorly known scientifically. Their work there eventually contributed to the establishment of Lomami National Park in 2016, the DRC's first new national park in decades. But the Lesula's existence as a formally described species is a reminder of how much the Congo Basin's inaccessibility is kept from scientific view. It is not just primates. New species of fish continue to be described from the Congo River system, which is extraordinary given that the Congo is already known to have the highest diversity of freshwater fish of any river system in Africa, with over 700 described species and estimates suggesting the true number may be considerably higher. The river's unusual depth, those sections exceeding 220 metres, has created isolated environments where fish populations have evolved in ways that are still being documented. Some species found in the deep channels of the Congo appear to have adapted to conditions of near total darkness and high pressure that are more reminiscent of deep-sea environments than typical river habitats. New plant species, new invertebrates, new fungi. The list of undescribed organisms in the basin is not a short one, and the pace of discovery is constrained almost entirely by the difficulty of getting researchers into the field. There is something genuinely humbling about this, if you sit with it for a moment. The Congo Basin is not some newly encountered wilderness that humans have just begun to examine. It has been the subject of scientific interest for well over 100 years. Natural history collections from the region date back to the colonial period, and the Musée Royal de l'Afrique Centrale in Tervuren, Belgium, established in 1910, holds millions of specimens collected from the Congo over more than a century. And yet the basin continues to yield new species, new geological structures, new carbon stores of global significance. The scientific picture is not nearly complete. It is, in some areas, barely begun. Part of this is simply the scale of the place. 3.5 million square kilometres of tropical forest contains an almost incomprehensible number of organisms, microhabitats, and ecological processes. Even if the forest were completely accessible, describing it fully would take generations of scientific work. But the inaccessibility matters too, and it matters in specific ways. The areas that remain least understood scientifically tend to be the areas that are hardest to reach. The deep interior swamps of the Cuvette Centrale, the flooded forests of the northern basin, the remote stretches of the Lomami and Chuapa river systems. These are precisely the areas where physical travel is most difficult, where political conditions are least stable, and where the forest's resistance to human entry is most complete. The gaps in scientific knowledge map almost directly onto the geography of impossibility that runs through every section of this story. What researchers have managed to document, even with these constraints, is already remarkable enough to suggest that what remains undocumented is likely equally so. The Congo Basin is home to forest elephants, whose population has declined catastrophically by more than 60% over the past decade according to some estimates, but whose full range and movement patterns in the interior are still not comprehensively mapped. It is home to okapes, the forest giraffe, whose distribution in the wild remains only partially understood. It is home to bonobos, one of our two closest living relatives, found only south of the Congo River, whose behaviour in remote forest populations is still being studied. The forest holds all of these things and more in a kind of scientific suspense, known to exist, imperfectly understood, accessible only with great difficulty and considerable risk. There is a practical dimension to this incompleteness that goes beyond academic curiosity. The carbon accounting question raised by the Cuvette Centrale peatlands is a good example. Before 2017, global climate models simply did not include the carbon stored in those peatlands, because the peatlands had not been characterised. This means that estimates of the Congo Basin's total carbon storage, and by extension estimates of what would be released if the basin were disturbed, were significantly underestimated. Peatlands store carbon in a particularly concentrated and vulnerable form. The organic matter accumulated over thousands of years in waterlogged conditions is preserved precisely because the water prevents decomposition. Drain the peat, or burn it, and that carbon enters the atmosphere relatively quickly. Knowing that 145,000 square kilometres of this material exists in the Congo interior is not just scientifically interesting, it is directly relevant to understanding the global carbon budget and the potential consequences of development in the region. The scientific incompleteness of the basin, in other words, has real-world consequences that extend far beyond the forest itself, and the incompleteness is not static. Researchers are working carefully and persistently to fill in the gaps. The TL2 project has continued its biodiversity surveys in the Lomami Basin. Satellite monitoring of forest cover has improved, even if ground-level characterization remains difficult. Acoustic monitoring, using automated recording devices to capture the sounds of wildlife in remote areas, has opened new ways of assessing biodiversity without requiring constant human presence. eDNA sampling, which involves analysing genetic material shed by organisms into water or soil, is beginning to be applied in tropical river systems and may eventually help document the Congo's aquatic biodiversity more completely. These are patient, methodical approaches suited to a place that does not yield its information easily or quickly. But it is worth acknowledging what all of this effort is working against. Every field season in the Congo interior involves the same logistical challenges that have confronted everyone who has tried to work there. The flooded terrain, the equipment decay, the health risks, the political uncertainties, the difficulty of communication and resupply. Researchers who spend time in the cuvette centrale describe conditions that would be recognisable to Stanley's porters: boots that rot, samples that must be carefully protected from moisture, days spent moving very short distances through very difficult ground. The tools are different: GPS units, satellite phones, molecular sampling kits, but the fundamental challenge of being physically present in the interior of the Congo Basin has not changed in its essential character. The forest does not make exceptions for scientific purposes. What the scientific picture of the Congo Basin ultimately reveals, then, is that the impossibility of crossing it is not just a physical or political condition, it is also an epistemic one. There are things about this forest that we simply do not know yet, not because the questions have not been asked, but because the answers are stored in places that are extraordinarily difficult to reach. The interior of the basin holds information about species, about carbon, about ecological processes, about the deep history of the African rainforest that has not yet been retrieved and may not be for some time. In a world that has become accustomed to the idea that information is freely and instantly available, the Congo Basin is a quiet reminder that some knowledge still requires presence, patience, and the willingness to endure considerable hardship to obtain. And yet, even with all of this scientific uncertainty, the forest does have a kind of internal logic, a way of organising movement and life and exchange that belongs to it, that has always belonged to it, and that has never depended on the possibility of crossing from one edge to the other. That logic is carried most visibly on the water. Because while the overland crossing of the Congo Basin remains something that has not been verifiably accomplished, the river itself has always offered a different kind of passage, slower, stranger, more patient, and in some ways more honest about what the forest actually is, and what it asks of the people who move through it. The river barges of the Congo are not quite like anything else that exists in the world. That is not an exaggeration made for effect. It is simply the honest description of what they are. If you have read accounts of travel on the Congo River, or seen photographs, or spoken to anyone who has made the journey between Kinshasa and Kisangani, the image that comes back is always the same: a slow, enormous, rusting barge, sometimes several barges lashed together side by side, moving upstream at a pace that can feel almost geological, surrounded by the dark green wall of the forest on both banks, carrying somewhere between several hundred and over 1,000 people, along with their goods, their animals, their cooking fires, their music, and their commerce. The journey between Kinshasa and Kisangani covers roughly 1,750 kilometers of river. In the best conditions, with a functioning engine and reasonable water levels, it takes somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks upstream. Downstream, with the current, it can be done somewhat faster, but not dramatically so. In less favourable conditions, and conditions on the Congo River are frequently less than favourable, the journey can stretch to 6 weeks or more. There are accounts from the 1990s and early 2000s of barges breaking down mid-river and drifting for days while repairs were attempted. Passengers simply waiting, trading, cooking, sleeping, as the forest slid past on both sides. The barges themselves are usually pushed by a tugboat, a pousseur in the French that remains the working language of the DRC, and they carry everything: smoked fish, dried cassava, charcoal, palm oil, live chickens, goats, sometimes pigs. Traders from river towns come aboard at intermediate stops and sell food through the railings. People sleep on the deck under makeshift shelters of tarpaulin and palm fronds. Cooking happens on small charcoal stoves balanced on the deck edge, which is genuinely alarming to watch if you are not accustomed to it. There are no formal schedules. The barges leave when they are ready, which could mean any day in a window of several weeks, and they stop when they need to, which could be for hours or for days. Journalists and travellers who have made the journey, and there are not many but there are some, describe it as an experience that resets your sense of time. You stop measuring distance in kilometres and start measuring it in days. You stop thinking about where you're going and start thinking about what's happening on the barge right now, because the barge becomes its own world. People who board as strangers are living in close quarters within hours. There are arguments and friendships and small transactions and shared meals and long stretches of silence. The forest is always there, on both sides, close enough to see individual trees in the morning light but still impenetrable, still absolute in its refusal to offer a way in. This is the closest thing that exists to a crossing of the Congo Basin. It is not an overland crossing. It does not touch the interior. It follows the main river channel, which is itself a corridor carved through the forest rather than a route through it. But it is the route that the forest permits. The river is the one place where the basin's accumulated resistance, the swamps, the canopy, the insects, the mud, the political fragmentation, temporarily relents. Or rather, it offers a different set of challenges. The river has its own dangers, hippos, which are genuinely aggressive and have capsized smaller vessels, sudden storms that raise the water quickly, submerged obstacles, the mechanical unreliability of aging vessels. But these are manageable dangers, at least in principle, in a way that the overland alternative is not. The pirogue culture of the tributary rivers is a smaller, more intimate version of the same logic. A pirogue is a dugout canoe, carved from a single large tree trunk, and on the Congo's tributaries it is the fundamental unit of movement. People travel by pirogue to fish, to trade, to visit family in the next river settlement, to carry goods between communities that have no other connection to each other. The skill involved in handling a pirogue on a fast-moving tributary, or navigating the shallow vegetation-choked side channels of the swamp forest, is considerable and takes years to develop. It is not the kind of skill that can be acquired quickly by an outsider, which is part of why outside travellers on the tributary rivers are so dependent on local knowledge and local paddlers. The tributary rivers also function as markets. At certain confluences, or at particular points along a river that have become established trading locations, pirogues gather and exchange goods: dried fish for cassava, palm oil for cloth, charcoal for salt. These transactions have been happening for a very long time. The river trade of the Congo Basin predates European contact by centuries, and the trade networks that existed before colonialism were complex and extensive, connecting communities across large distances through the river system. What the colonial and post-colonial periods disrupted was not the river logic itself, but the specific political and economic structures built around it. The river logic persisted because it had to. It is the only logic the forest actually supports. There is something worth sitting with here about what this means for the idea of crossing. The word crossing implies a movement from one side to another, a transect, a line drawn through a space to get to something on the other side. It is a fundamentally outsider concept. The forest as an obstacle between 2 points of interest. The river barge culture and the pirogue culture and the way the forest peoples have always organised their movement along waterways suggest a completely different relationship to the space. The river is not a way through the forest. It is a way of being in the forest. The distinction matters. When a trader boards a barge in Kinshasa and rides it upstream to a river town 3 weeks away, she's not crossing the Congo Basin. She's participating in the basin's own circulatory system. The goods she carries will be exchanged for other goods, which will travel further by pirogue into the tributary system, which will eventually reach communities that have no other connection to the outside world. This is how the basin has always moved things and people and information. Slowly, along water, in a network rather than a line. The idea of a crossing, a single, directed, overland transect from one edge to the other, is not just physically difficult. It is, in a certain sense, a category error. It is applying the logic of a different kind of landscape to a place that has its own entirely different logic. The practical consequences of this are visible in how the DRC actually functions as a country. The Democratic Republic of Congo is roughly the size of Western Europe. It has a population of over 100 million people, distributed across an enormous and varied geography, and it is held together, to the extent that it is held together, primarily by air travel and river transport, not by roads. Kinshasa, the capital, has a population of around 15 million and is one of the largest cities in Africa. Kisangani, the largest city in the interior, has a population of around 1 million. The distance between them, as we have noted, is roughly 1,750 kilometers by river. There is no functioning road between them. There is no railway between them. The river barge is the practical connection, and even that connection is irregular, slow, and dependent on the mechanical condition of aging vessels. This is not a temporary situation caused by recent political problems, though the political problems have certainly made it worse. It is a structural condition produced by the geography and biology of the basin itself. The Belgian colonial administration, which was not known for underinvesting in infrastructure when that infrastructure served its extraction interests, could not build a road across the interior that lasted. The independent Congolese government, operating under far more constrained conditions, has not been able to either. The forest keeps winning this argument, not through any dramatic single event, but through the patient continuous application of rain, heat, root systems and insect activity to any surface that humans try to impose on it. What this means, practically, is that the river remains not just the best option for crossing the basin, but essentially the only option. And the river, on its own terms, is a genuine thing. The barge journeys are not a failure of infrastructure. They are an adaptation to the reality of the place. The traders who ride those barges know the river towns, know the stopping points, know the seasonal variations in water level that affect which channels are navigable. They carry knowledge that is specific and practical and accumulated over generations. The pirogue paddlers on the tributaries know their rivers in the same way. The submerged rocks, the fast channels, the places where the current shifts, the times of year when certain fish are in certain places. This is, in its way, a form of crossing, not the clean, directed overland transect that outside imaginations tend to picture when they think about traversing a rainforest, but a real movement through a real space conducted on the forest's own terms at the forest's own pace, using the forest's own corridors. It is slower than anyone raised on the idea of modern transport would find comfortable. It is more uncertain, more dependent on conditions, more socially embedded. But it works. It has always worked. The river has been carrying people and goods through the Congo basin for longer than written records exist to document it, and perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about the question of crossing the Congo basin. The crossing that outsiders imagine, fast, overland, comprehensive from edge to edge, has never been accomplished, and given everything we have examined, is unlikely to be accomplished without extraordinary resources and considerable danger. But the crossing that the forest actually permits has been happening continuously, for a very long time, in the hands of people who understand that the way to move through this place is to follow its water, respect its pace, and carry only what the river can bear. The barge culture, the pirogue culture, the slow rhythms of river trade. These are not consolation prizes for the absence of roads. They are the answer the forest has always offered to the question of how to move through it. That answer is worth understanding clearly before turning to what may be coming next for the basin, because the forces that are now beginning to press against the Congo's inaccessibility are not interested in learning the river's logic. They are interested in replacing it with something faster, more extractable, and far less patient. And what happens when those forces arrive, and what the cost of that arrival might be, is a question the forest has not yet had to fully answer. Those forces have a name, or rather they have several names, and they have been gathering at the edges of the basin for some time now. Before we follow them in, it is worth pausing to understand what it is they are approaching, not just as a geographic space or a political territory, but as a system. Because the Congo Basin is not simply a large forest. It is one of the most consequential pieces of living infrastructure on the planet, and its inaccessibility, which has frustrated explorers and engineers and administrators for centuries, has also been, quietly and without any intention, one of the most effective conservation mechanisms in the history of the natural world. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. The Congo Basin absorbs roughly 1.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. That figure comes from multiple studies, including work published in the journal Nature in 2020, and it places the Congo alongside the Amazon as one of the two great carbon sinks that help regulate the entire planet's atmospheric chemistry. The Amazon gets more attention in this conversation, partly because deforestation there has been more dramatic and more visible, and partly because it is geographically closer to the centres of global media. But the Congo is doing comparable work quietly, in a part of the world that most people never think about. Every year that the forest stands, it is pulling enormous quantities of carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it into wood, soil, and the vast peatlands beneath the forest floor. And the peatlands especially matter here. The Cuvette Centrale peatlands, which we touched on earlier in this story, are not just ecologically significant as habitat, they are carbon stores. The 2017 study led by Simon Lewis and Greta Dargy estimated that those peatlands alone contain approximately 30 billion tonnes of carbon, equivalent to roughly 3 years of total global fossil fuel emissions. That carbon has been accumulating in the waterlogged soil for thousands of years, preserved by the very conditions that make the interior of the basin so difficult to reach: the permanent flooding, the heat, the anaerobic conditions beneath the water table that prevent organic matter from decomposing and releasing its carbon back into the air. This is the thing that makes what happened in 2022 so striking to the scientists who study this region. In July of that year, the Democratic Republic of Congo held an auction of oil and gas exploration blocks. 30 blocks in total were offered. Several of them overlapped directly with the Cuvette Centrale peatlands. The Congolese government's position was not difficult to understand from a political economy perspective. The DRC is one of the poorest countries in the world by per capita income, despite sitting on mineral wealth of extraordinary scale. It has a population of over 100 million people, many of whom live without reliable electricity, clean water, or access to healthcare. The argument that a country in that position should forgo the revenue from its own natural resources in order to protect a global carbon sink that benefits the entire planet, while wealthier nations that have already burned their own forests and fossil fuels continue to do so, is not a simple argument to make. It is, in fact, a deeply uncomfortable one. The scientists who raised the alarm about the auction understood this. Many of them were careful to acknowledge it, but the alarm was genuine, because the science is clear. If those peatlands are drained and disturbed in the process of oil and gas extraction, the carbon they contain will not stay in the ground. It will enter the atmosphere. And the amount of carbon involved is not marginal. It is by any reasonable measure catastrophic in scale. The oil and gas question is the most dramatic version of the pressure the basin is facing, but it is not the only one. Deforestation in the Congo Basin has historically been slower than in the Amazon. The inaccessibility of the interior has meant that large-scale industrial agriculture and logging have had a harder time reaching the forest's core. But the rates are accelerating. Satellite data from Global Forest Watch shows that the DRC has consistently ranked among the top countries in the world for annual tree cover loss over the past decade. And the drivers of that loss are different from what most people picture when they think about tropical deforestation. It is not primarily industrial soy farming or cattle ranching, as in parts of the Amazon. In the Congo Basin, the dominant driver is charcoal production and subsistence agriculture, small scale, dispersed, driven by the energy needs of a rapidly growing population that has very few alternatives. Kinshasa alone, with its 15 million people, consumes an enormous quantity of charcoal for cooking fuel every day. That charcoal has to come from somewhere, and increasingly it is coming from the forests on the city's expanding edges. This is a harder problem to address than industrial deforestation in some ways, because it does not have a single corporate actor or a single policy lever. It is distributed across millions of individual households, making rational decisions about how to cook their food with the resources available to them. Addressing it requires either providing affordable alternatives to charcoal, which requires infrastructure investment and energy access that the DRC currently cannot reliably provide, or it requires the kind of international financial support that has been discussed in climate negotiations for years without materializing in anything like the quantities needed. The gap between what is scientifically necessary and what is politically and economically feasible is, in the Congo Basin, very wide. And then there is the road question. Because roads are coming, not quickly and not comprehensively, but the pressure to build them is real and it is increasing. China has been the most active external actor in Congolese infrastructure development over the past 2 decades, with road and rail projects under various agreements that have moved at different speeds and with different levels of completion. The African Development Bank and other multilateral institutions have also financed road projects in the DRC. The stated rationale is development, connecting communities, reducing the cost of transporting goods, integrating the national economy. These are legitimate goals. A country the size of Western Europe that has no functioning road between its capital and its largest interior city is, by any reasonable measure, underconnected in ways that impose real costs on real people. But the research on tropical deforestation is consistent on one point. Roads are the primary driver of forest loss, not because roads themselves destroy forest, but because roads enable everything else. They allow loggers to reach timber that was previously too remote to extract economically. They allow agricultural expansion by making it possible to move produce to markets. They allow settlers to reach land that was previously too isolated to farm. In the Amazon, the pattern has been documented in exhaustive detail. Deforestation follows roads with a regularity that can be predicted from satellite data almost in real time. There is no particular reason to think the Congo Basin would be different. The forest's inaccessibility has not been a policy choice. It has been a geographic accident, a consequence of the terrain and the climate and the river system. If roads reduce that inaccessibility, the forest will face the same pressures that have reduced the Amazon by roughly 20% of its original extent. What makes this genuinely complicated rather than simply tragic is that the people who live in the Congo Basin are not abstractions. There are over 100 million human beings with legitimate needs and legitimate claims on their own country's future. The Mbuti communities in the Ituri forest, the river traders on the barges, the farmers on the forest edges, the residents of Kinshasa cooking on charcoal fires. None of them signed up to be the custodians of a global carbon sink. The forest's importance to the global climate system was not something they chose. It is something that was assigned to them, implicitly, by the rest of the world's decision to burn its own resources first and then ask the remaining forest to compensate. There is a justice dimension to this that the climate conversation does not always handle well. Some researchers and policymakers have pointed toward payment for ecosystem services as a potential mechanism, essentially compensating the DRC and its people financially for the carbon storage that the intact forest provides to the global atmosphere. The idea has been discussed in various forms for decades. REDD+, the UN framework for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, has been operational in various pilot forms since the mid-2000s. The results have been mixed, funding has been inconsistent, governance challenges in the DRC have complicated implementation, and the amounts of money involved, even when they materialise, have not been large enough to compete with the economic incentives for extraction. A ton of carbon stored in a peatland is worth something in an abstract global accounting sense. It is worth considerably less in immediate practical terms than a barrel of oil. The forest does not know any of this, of course. It does not know about carbon markets or oil auctions or development bank loan agreements. It continues doing what it has done for tens of thousands of years, growing, flooding, cycling nutrients, absorbing rainfall, storing carbon, sheltering an extraordinary density of life. The Lesser monkey discovered in 2012, the peatlands mapped in 2017, the species that have still not been formally described, they're all part of a system that has been running quietly and continuously, protected largely by the simple fact that it was too difficult to reach. That protection has not been permanent. Nothing about a forest is permanent, but it has lasted long enough to make the Congo Basin one of the most biodiverse and carbon-rich places on Earth. The question of what comes next is not settled. It is not even close to settled. The oil blocks auctioned in 2022 have not yet been developed. Exploration is a long process, and the economics of frontier oil development are complicated. The road projects that have been announced and partially funded have not all been completed, and some have stalled. The DRC's political situation remains unstable enough that large-scale foreign investment faces real risks. The forest is not gone. It is not even, by global standards, dramatically diminished. The rates of loss are concerning, but the basin's core remains largely intact. There is still time, in the sense that the forest is still there to protect. But the direction of pressure is clear. The forces that are moving toward the Congo Basin, the economic, political, demographic, infrastructural, are not moving away from it. The inaccessibility that has protected the forest for so long is not a permanent condition. It is a condition that can be changed by roads, by investment, by political decisions, by the sheer growth of a population that needs land and energy and economic opportunity. And when that inaccessibility decreases, the forest will face a test that its biology and geography have never had to pass before, because the previous tests, the colonial road builders, the Victorian explorers, the early independence-era administrators, all failed, and the forest absorbed their failure and continued. The forces now assembling are different in scale, in technology, and in economic motivation. Whether the forest can continue to resist them, or whether it will need a different kind of protection entirely, one that comes from human decisions rather than geographic accident, is the question that the next chapter of the Congo Basin story will have to answer. And it is worth sitting with that question for a moment, because it is not only a question about one forest in Central Africa. It is a question about what we are willing to protect and why, and who gets to decide, and what we are prepared to offer in return. Those are not simple questions. They do not have clean answers. But they are the questions that the Congo Basin is now, quietly and patiently, beginning to force the world to face. So here we are, at the end of something that was never really a story with a clean ending. That is fitting, in a way. The Congo Basin does not do clean endings. It does not do clean anything. It does the long, slow, continuous, indifferent work of being alive at a scale that is genuinely difficult for the human mind to hold. What the forest teaches, if you sit with it long enough, is that impossibility is not always a failure of human effort. Sometimes it is just a description of how the world is arranged. The Congo Basin is not impossible to cross because people have not tried hard enough, or thought cleverly enough, or assembled the right equipment. It is impossible, or very nearly so, because of the accumulated weight of everything we have talked about over this long journey together. The terrain, the water, the climate, The biology, the disease, the political fractures, the sheer depth of a forest that has been growing and flooding and cycling for longer than most human civilizations have existed. All of those things together produce something that is not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a condition, a state of being. The forest is not broken. It is not waiting to be fixed. It is simply itself, and it is very, very large. There is something worth sitting with in the contrast between what outsiders have imagined the Congo to be and what it actually is. The Victorian explorers who came with their columns of porters and their compasses and their extraordinary personal courage imagined the forest as an obstacle, something to be endured and pushed through and overcome. The colonial administrators who came with their railways and their road gangs imagined it as a resource to be organised and extracted from. The adventurers who have come more recently with their satellite phones and their lightweight gear have imagined it as a challenge to be completed, a box to be ticked. And all of them, in their different ways and for their different reasons, have found that the forest does not organise itself around those expectations. It does not cooperate with the narrative of the crossing. It simply continues, in its wet and heavy and indifferent way, being what it is. The Muti and the Aka and the Baka and the other forest peoples understood something that outsiders have consistently underestimated. The forest is not a space to be crossed. It is a place to be inhabited slowly and specifically, and in relationship with its particular rhythms. Their knowledge is not a shortcut to a crossing. It is something entirely different, a knowledge of how to be present in a specific part of the forest, how to read its signs, how to move with its logic rather than against it. That kind of knowledge took tens of thousands of years to develop. It is not transferable to a map, and it is not a guide to the basin as a whole, because the basin as a whole is not really a single place. It is a vast accumulation of local places, each one specific and layered and known, if it is known at all, only by the people who have lived within it across generations. That is one of the things that gets lost when we talk about the Congo as an abstraction, as the world's second lung, as a carbon sink, as a biodiversity hotspot, as a geopolitical challenge. All of those framings are real and important, but they flatten something. The basin is also just a place where people live, where the river runs brown and wide in the rainy season and a little lower in the dry, where the barge from Kinshasa arrives, eventually after 2 or 3 or 4 weeks carrying traders and chickens and cassava and the accumulated small commerce of the river, where the forest at the edge of a village smells of wet earth and something sweet and slightly rotting, the way all living things smell when they are very much alive, where a Lasula monkey sits in a tree in the Lomami basin and watches the world go by with those large calm eyes, unaware that it was only formally described to science in 2012, unaware of any of this. The silence of the interior, and there are places in the Congo basin where the silence is very deep, broken only by rain and insects and the occasional distant call of something unseen. That silence is not emptiness. It is full. It is full of things we have not yet named, processes we have not yet understood, relationships between species that have been working themselves out for millions of years without any human witness or record. The 2017 discovery of the Cuvette Centrale peatlands, sitting there across 145,000 square kilometres, storing roughly 30 billion tonnes of carbon, undocumented by science until a team of researchers finally found a way to get in and look. That discovery is a small reminder of how much the interior still holds that we simply do not know. And if a peatland that large can remain unmapped until 2017, it is reasonable to wonder what else is in there. What other systems, what other species, what other slow and patient processes are still going on, unrecorded, in the parts of the basin that remain genuinely inaccessible? The forest's patience is one of the things that comes back to me, thinking about all of this. It is not a dramatic quality. It is not cinematic in any obvious way, but it is real. The Congo Basin has outlasted every attempt to impose a human timeline on it. Stanley's expedition, with all its suffering and determination, was absorbed. The colonial railways and roads built at such terrible cost were absorbed. The post-independence collapse of infrastructure was absorbed. The forest grew back over the roads. The rivers shifted in their channels. The swamps refilled. The canopy closed. Not quickly, by human standards, but steadily, consistently, without effort, because patience is not something the forest practices. It is simply what the forest is. Whether that patience will be enough for what is coming, for the oil blocks and the road projects and the demographic pressure and the charcoal fires and all the accumulated weight of 100 million people's legitimate needs, that is genuinely uncertain. The forest has never faced pressure at this scale, with this technology, with this economic motivation behind it. The previous attempts to penetrate the basin were limited by the very conditions that make it impenetrable. The new pressures are different because they come with tools that are specifically designed to overcome those conditions. Heavy machinery that can work in swampy ground, satellite navigation that does not need to see the sky, drilling technology that can reach oil beneath a peatland. The forest defences were calibrated for a different kind of threat. But the story is not finished. That is the honest thing to say. The Congo Basin is still there. The peatlands are still intact, or most of them are. The Lisala monkey is still in the Lomami Basin. The barges are still making their slow way between Kinshasa and Kisangani, taking weeks, loaded with everything imaginable, moving at the pace the river allows. The Mbuti are still in the Ituri forest. The Boyoma Falls are still falling, all 7 of them, over the basalt that stopped Stanley and stopped everyone who came after him. The deep water of the Congo River is still running, 220 meters down in places, deeper than any other river on Earth, carrying its enormous discharge toward the Atlantic. All of that is still there. What we do with that fact, what the world does with the knowledge that one of the last great intact tropical forests is still standing, still functioning, still absorbing carbon and sheltering life and running its ancient water cycles. That is a human question, not a forest question. The forest does not have opinions about it. It will respond to whatever happens the way it always has, slowly, completely, without drama. If it is left alone, it will continue. If it is opened up, it will change, and the change will be large and probably irreversible on any human timescale. Those are the stakes, stated plainly. I think what I find most quietly remarkable about the Congo Basin, after all of this, is that it has remained itself so thoroughly, for so long, against so many pressures. That is not nothing. In a world where most of the large wild places have been significantly altered, the Congo Basin is still, in its core, something close to what it was before any of this began. That is an extraordinary thing. It is worth acknowledging as something extraordinary, not just as a statistic or a conservation talking point, but as a genuine fact about the world we live in. There is a place on this earth, roughly the size of the entire European Union, that has resisted every attempt to cross it, that has swallowed roads and railways and expeditions and kept its interior largely to itself. That place is still there. It is still breathing. If you have made it to the end of this journey with me, I want to thank you, genuinely. This has been a long one, and I know that. We covered a lot of ground, or tried to, which is perhaps the right way to put it, when the subject is a place that resists that kind of covering. I hope some of it settled in a way that felt worth the time. I would love to know, if you want to leave a comment, what surprised you most. Was it the depth of the Congo River? The peatlands discovered in 2017? The way the forest reclaimed the colonial roads within years? The barges that take weeks to make a journey that a plane covers in an hour? There is no wrong answer. This place has a way of catching people in different places. If you are new here, and this is the first time you have spent a night with Life Beyond Seen, I hope it felt like a comfortable place to be. We do this kind of thing regularly. Long, slow journeys into places and questions and stories that deserve more than a quick summary. If that sounds like something you would like more of, subscribing would mean a great deal, and so would a quiet like before you go. It is late now, or early, depending on where you are and how you have arranged your night. The forest is still out there, doing what it does. The rain is probably falling somewhere over the Cuvette Centrale right now, as it almost always is. The river is running. The canopy is holding its breath, or maybe it is exhaling. It is hard to tell the difference from this distance. Sleep well wherever you are, and thank you, as always, for being here.